Good morning and welcome to everyone in the room, in the house, and also to all of those joining us online to this very important stakeholder engagement on the Fair Pay Bill. It is such a joy for me to welcome you into a space designed for constructive and collaborative conversation. My name is Nande Boss, simply here to help guide the program today and also hold space for thoughtful and respectful dialogue as we test together. Will the Fair Pay Bill work in the real world and not just in theory? We are here today because the South African labor market continues to carry the weight of a painful history, one in which discrimination affects not just opportunity, but income itself. The ongoing practice of relying on a payslip or salary history to determine your current now embeds the inequalities of the past in our present day. So the Fair Pay Bill challenges us. It speaks to this challenge directly, and it challenges us to confront the realities. It asks us to consider what would it mean if salaries reflected the value of work and not the individual's strength to overcome struggle? What would it mean if transparency and fairness are worked into the system and not left to individual goodwill? The Fair Pay Bill is asking us questions as much as we need to now ask it questions. What will it do for us? And so before we begin, I would love to acknowledge this broad and diverse group of people represented here as we test together. I'd like to acknowledge the Gender and Justice Women's Economic Security group represented here. I'd like to acknowledge labor organizations who carry the lived experiences of inequality, a big word, but people who understand it practically. I'd like to acknowledge business and employer groups whose participation is very important as we make the bill practical and implementable in the real life. We've got youth voices in the room who are entering the labor market, will inherit it, but also have an opportunity to transform it. I'd like to acknowledge civil society, who often names the challenges that go unseen, and of course, Parliament, who will ultimately shape the bill into law. We have a broad and diverse group which allows for robust conversation. I trust that you feel welcome. A few housekeeping rules my side. There is Wi-Fi available that you can connect to, and what else is important is that every voice from the different groups that I've mentioned finds a pathway onto the program, even though time or speaking opportunities may limit, but your voice still matters. And how we're going to get that feedback is through a digital tool, QR codes that will pop up on the screens. And when they do, please, I'd like to invite you to take out your phone. There we go. This is how you now get an opportunity to share your voice. Scan as the link pops up, save it on your browser. Upon my prompting, you will be able to contribute and answer questions that we deal with today. Also, remember, whatever you input is anonymous, right? So you don't need to say your name. You're not going to be in trouble. Be as honest as possible. That will help us test that the bill truly live in reality and not just in theory. I can also tell the story of why or what led us here. Right? The Fair Pay Bill is not a BOSA initiative, although BOSA has now become the vehicle to take into Parliament. The Pay Me Fair campaign, which the video speaks to, is the womb that birthed the baby. that we now get to decide, are we going to be part of the village that's going to nurture this baby till the baby walks and thrives as a possible? We get to decide, right, if we're going to nurture the baby. The thing that I want to say is that the baby is already here. We hear the cry, so we can't ignore it. The best is to participate and nurture it and raise it to be what it needs to be in reality. It is a tool that is part of a broader economic justice movement. What is needed today, which I want us to keep in mind, is that it's a collaborative journey, and it's collaborative, collective ownership, meaning business to ensure the bill lives healthily in the workplace, meaning activists to do the word work and mobilization that people are in the know. It's difficult to test something that you don't even know exists. We need worker movements with their finger on the pulse as things happen in real time. We need legal partners to speak to, and researchers and academia to speak to what the bill can do and what the bill can't do. So as we move to the next segment, I do want you to keep the collective journey in mind, yes? Yeah, I am going to call up to the podium someone who can paint us a picture of the social and emotional cost of unfair pay. It is important for us to understand what happens to dignity, what happens to opportunity, what happens to trust when we rely solely on salary history. I'm going to call up Honorable Dr. Musi Maimane to contribute his personal story and set our hopes for the engagement of today in a way that's meaningful and set the pace, set the tone as we start this morning. Can you help me welcome Dr. Musi Maimane?
Good morning, everybody. It's good to see everybody. And first of all, let me, before I get on with speaking, I want to thank all the individuals who have been involved with putting today together. I think it's a significant moment. I want to thank the parliamentary team that has been working hard on making sure the bill is processed and we can have public consultation. The team from BOSA who have put today together with all the immense amount of work that they have done. And I just acknowledge the fact that the fight for the advancement of freedom is never an easy one. It is one that needs work, it needs commitment, it needs dedication, and it takes people who are willing to pay the price to do the work. So I want to thank you, especially personally, and just on behalf of South Africans, just say thank you. If you could join me and give them a special hand. I'm not going to be long. It's one of those. We're here. I've learned a new term. We're here for a good time, not a long time. So I'm not going to be long. I hope it'll be good. In 1994, Nelson Mandela, in his acceptance speech, penned such incredible words. He said, "We have at last achieved political emancipation. We pledge ourselves to liberate all of our people from the continuing bondage of poverty, deprivation, suffering, gender, and other discrimination. Never," he concludes that address, "never and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another and suffer the indignity of being the skunk of the world." It'd be amiss of me not to acknowledge that when we reflect on those words, indeed, South Africa, this weekend, post the G20 summit, proved once again that we refuse in any way to be the skunk of the world and have made progress. And I want to say, as a South African, watching many heads of state arrived in the country, I thought that was a beautiful development and a moment for all of us as South Africans to look back and say, we're no longer could be the skunk of the world. And indeed, South Africa is making progress in this regard. The second of the promise that President Nelson Mandela premised 1994 with is that we aim to liberate our people. Now, liberation in 1994 meant that we started off by rewriting laws that discriminated people. We removed apartheid in our statutes. But that did not mean, as I interpret what Nelson Mandela said on the day, he said, even though we've achieved freedom, all we have merely achieved is the freedom to be free. And therefore, in that, when we begin to speak today about this bill, we could talk about all the technicalities, we can talk about all the issues, but in all reality, it is indeed an advancement of the freedom to be free. I'm a child of a mother who was a cashier, a father who worked in a factory. Both of them suffered under apartheid. They knew intentionally that the best they could do was for their children, not for themselves. For much of my high school, my mother did not work. My first job I got was working at a shoe sales. You will not believe this, but I worked for Total Sports. I sold shoes. And it used to be such a thing to wake up on a Saturday morning to go temp this job. In some ways, it was part of our household income because my parents didn't have to look after me, so it contributed to the total income pool. I worked in the same place with a friend of mine called Tim. I call him Tim because that might give you a hint at his race. I lived in Soweto and Dobsonville. He lived in Northgate. And for him, getting to work was a question of asking his parents for a lift, and they could just get to work. For me, getting to work meant I needed to leave Dobsonville, go up to the city center of Johannesburg, catch taxis from Bree Street, and then travel all the way to Northgate. And then do the reverse at the end of that shift on that day. It did mean that for the day, 40% of my income was inherently spent on transport, whereas the rest meant that I could do with it the little that I can. The sad reality is that situation, I had that job in 1998. In all reality, today, the conditions of most South Africans who wake up every day to go to work have not changed significantly. In fact, I would argue more that the perpetuation of our society has remained largely on those two tracks. I'm not here to create a race warfare or a class warfare. And so mentioning race and income per racial group is not to suggest that we must pit one race against another. We must appreciate, as Nelson Mandela said, that we have the difficult job of liberating all South Africans. So when we talk about freedom, it is the benefit of all. So let me give you the picture of what when somebody gets up publicly and says the face of poverty is largely black and female, we kind of accept that. We don't interrogate what sits below that statement. What does it in fact mean? So there are just some thoughts that I made contact with the statistician general of South Africa so that we get their official line and statistics as to where they go. So for an African household, their median income sits at close to about 143,000. Their expenditure is 108,000. And so you can appreciate that in an African household, the amount of money that is left for any savings, for any expenditure is less relative to if you're a white household, their income sits at 676,000 and the expenditure sits at 409,000. And so you can appreciate the buffer in income, right? My wife is a white South African, so her income clearly is higher than mine, relatively. When you think about quintiles, we talk about class distribution, but actually South Africa is probably the best way to think about it is through 5 quintiles. Let's understand where income sits in the country. The upper quintile is anyone who earns above 106,000. The second The second quintile is about, or the fourth quintile, which is from the upper one, is 49,000 to 106,000. The third quintile is 27,431 to 449,000. The second quintile is 14,000 to 27,000. The lowest, the lower quintile is at 14,000. So if those are the 5 quintiles, think about what you earn, where you live, and how much money you spend. But here's the thing that you should appreciate. In the upper quintile of the issue, 73% of white South Africans occupy this. Sorry, I'm getting additional feedback, which means either the points are doubly made or not. And in the lower income, if you were to take both black and colored South Africans, they constitute 40% of that space. So when we talk about household income in a nation where the median wage is 95,000 per household across the country, let's understand that when we talk the Fair Pay Bill, we're not just being sloganeering. We are talking justice. We are talking about fairness. We're talking about how do we help South Africans prosper together. I think it's important that when we come into this discussion, appreciate that from a child. Imagine a child like me who grew up in Soweto, and then people benchmark my income on the basis of the community I come from. Could you not appreciate that there is no ways I would move from the 4th quintile or the 2nd or the 3rd quintile? There's no ways if you benchmark my salary on historical basis, I would ever today move to the top quintile of the discussion. It just would never happen. You could benchmark me against my parents, you could benchmark me against anybody, but the facts on the table are there is no ways I would be able to move up anyway. So it's not just a question of fairness, it is a function of justice. It is also a function of appreciating that for many people, their income isn't just a reflection of their pay slip or their status in society. It is the very essence of dignity. Work isn't just about getting up every day and going somewhere. Work gives you esteem. It gives you purpose. It gives you a sense upon which when you go somewhere, you could say, actually, for me, I feel as a human being that I have dignity. Maybe I've never told you why I got into politics. I got into politics because on my journey in searching out, when you grow up in Soweto, you may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you, right? And so we lived, and then I worked in church. And I became even more concerned about people who were homeless. I began to ask around, why are people homeless? And then I asked all the various political parties because I'd moved from the township to the suburb, quote unquote. All of us live in a suburb. It's just some suburbs are still spatially discriminated as per apartheid and others are advanced. So that's the argument. But the point is, as I was going through, I remember looking at Rosebank and thinking, why are there so many homeless people? It's a bit like Sea Point and Greenpoint. Why is that? So I called all the members of parliament. I said, I'd like to talk to you about this because we're a church and we want to help. Until somebody said, because this was my assumption. I thought everyone who's homeless is homeless because they don't have a job or they're on drugs or whatever the case might be. Other social factors. And not that those aren't always true. But what this MP said to me, said people are homeless because they are underemployed. The cost of getting to work relative to the income they earn does not support them commuting to and from work every day. Therefore, it becomes necessary that they sleep under the bridge so that they can get to work every day. So if we honestly are thinking to ourselves as society, how do we address this injustice? Surely it must begin with saying, how do we achieve fairness in remuneration? How do we make sure that citizens have an ability to move from the lowest quintile to the middle in quintile. Our income inequality in South Africa renders our society unstable. It means that, as political leaders often say, if we're not careful, it's only a matter of time before the poor will want to eat the rich. The bill is a fight for justice. It is an expression of dignity. It is an acknowledgement of the fact that for far too long, wages have remained stagnant and have not been able to catch up with inflation. Many South Africans feel this. I don't know if you do. But as they say famously, that at the end of the money, there's still more month left. Because that's the difficulty. People are having to make tough decisions. They're making a decision about whether to buy food or be able to afford other items. I think the vision that Nelson Mandela set us in his address is something that could be given expression through this bill. The fourth point I want to make is the fact that, along with our inequality, we face a profound crisis of capitalism. Now, I'm not anti-capital. I'm merely just trying to indicate that we're living in a society that is transition. All of us sitting in this room, I was so impressed when people said, "No, pick up a QR code." I was like, hey, these people are fancy. Bro, now we grew up in school when people used to say, take out your foolscap paper. now people are QR coding themselves away. I'm just telling you that if you know what a foolscap paper is, when COVID comes around, don't go out. You are the vulnerable group now. But technology has made work be redefined. We lived through an industrial era of economics, and in an industrial era, the worker was only part of the production line. You would sit and we could say to you, we remunerate you for X amount of hours so that you can move goods from one place to another. And so we knew you could clock in the morning and clock out at night. And so we remunerated you for 8 hours. Then as we moved to the third and fourth industrial revolution, we saw how technology accelerated our ability to do things quickly and more effectively. It begged the question, what used to take you 8 hours of work now can only take you 4 hours of work. The dilemma is that as capitalism came on board, it then began to say, well, we should not be remunerating you for 8 hours, we should remunerate you for 4 hours. AI today is introducing a different conversation. What used to take you 8 hours, I've just completed, I don't say this for any other thing, but when I did my PhD, towards the end, AI was easier to get research information quickly. So what used to take me days when I started before COVID, towards the end, research piece on a particular section of work, I could quickly ask AI to be able to get me the research information. So what could take me a day when I started, suddenly took me an hour. Because you just plug it into AI, write questions, the information comes out. Now here's the question. Should I be remunerated for 8 or for 1? AI is going to introduce the crisis that asks, if all of us can do the same amount of work except in less time, what is the correlation to income in that question? I would argue, if we leave it to pure capitalism that's not interested in people, but capitalism that is focused on profit, you are going to end up in a scenario where, in all fairness, I must only remunerate you for 1 hour for the same amount of work that could have taken you 8. Or I wonder if we started to think about the face of people. I wonder if we started to think about households. Me, I'm starting to become even more convinced that maybe we need to think about 4-day work weeks. But we remunerate you the same. It's just that the amount of time that we now put into production is less relative to the issue. But we're not going to think like that. We are going to simply say, how much more can we consume and how much more can we do, and forget that human beings are not a cost center. Human beings are homes, they are husbands, they are wives, they are human beings. They're not human doings, to use that famous saying. So amidst this crisis, you can't help but think through, what does fair remuneration mean in the context of AI? What does fair remuneration mean when a CEO, I've just told you that median income in the country is 95,000 per year, which means monthly, you can work that out for yourself. You're smart enough. If you know how to use a QR code, I would assume you've used a calculator from time to time. But if that's your income, I could put the fact on the table that there are CEOs who earn R1 million a month. If we exacerbate that income inequality, my only point is not that maybe there's a debate happening in the world whether we need maximum wage. We've got minimum wage. Do we need maximum wage? Maybe I'm not here to enter that debate, except to ask this question. If I took 10% of a billionaire's income, would it impact their quality of life relative to the fact that if I took that 10% and just through wage, just through remunerating the people that work there, could I not achieve a space where their lives could be radically made different? So my basic point is this, and you need to hear me out here, is that sure, maybe we don't have maximum wage because we're in a globally competitive environment. But maybe the most redressive thing we could do is remunerate people better. I wonder if there's a debate happening in South Africa about whether apartheid or whether BBBEE should continue or not. It's not, I hear the argument, and I've been critical of BBBEE. In fact, I was one of the first who said, scrap the thing. Not because I don't believe there's a need for redress, because I believe we could do it better. Because I believe we could ultimately, if we remunerate, I wonder if you just change the law and said, don't give shares to just a few connected people, but remunerate your lowest employees better so that they can move from the 5th quintile to the 2nd and then to the 3rd. What if the tea lady in your place of work could be paid better? Could that not be more redress orientated than other things? Because you know, when people have an income, they can do what my mother did, which is to say, I'm going to finance you going to a better school. I'm going to make sure that you've got transport to get to that school. You will have a meal to get to that school. You give someone like my mother, who was a cashier, an opportunity to do something that the next generation of South Africans can be better off than what she was. Now, the funny thing is that today, I have to do the reverse. A term loosely termed black tax. Yeah? Which means now we have to look after our parents and our siblings. So the question of fair pay is also a justice question that helps deal with that question. For too many South Africans, they know it. Black, white, Indian, colored, we've all got a degree of tax that comes from families. That's the one SARS is not interested in. You become the person at home when you arrive. I know what it's like to be the uncle who, when at the start of the year, it's not just books for my kids, it's books for my nieces, it's books for my cousins, it's all of that. How is that reflected in the income that I earn? My point is this. If the parents of the previous generation who fought the struggle all they ask is that when they've spent all their money educating their child to be an accountant, may that child not, when they come to a place of work, be benchmarked with the income they come from, but rather be benchmarked with the income that is there. And if the majority of employers sit in the quintile that said, for a white South African, this is what they earn, let it be so that that same job is benchmarked for the same South African who's coming in place. Then it's fair. Let's ensure that if a man was doing a job and was earning 20,000 for that job, don't when a woman arrives to come and do the same job, we say to her, but you are a woman. Where you come from, you used to earn 10 for the same job. We will keep you at 12 just to adjust for inflation. If the job is worth 20, whether you are a man, whether you are a woman, whether you are black, whether you are white, whether you are young, whether you are old, you must be remunerated fairly for that job at that time. That's the fight. The fight is about saying, don't when I come to negotiate my wage, you look at me and you say, Chief, you are from Nkanduli. Really? In Nkanduli, things are cheaper than in Sandton. So no, it doesn't matter whether I'm from Nkanduli or Sandton. I'm going to spend that money in Nkanduli like I live in Sandton then. Right? That's fairness. That empowers the person to negotiate and say, firstly, I'd like to talk to a few people who work here so I understand what they are doing. Today, you will debate the technicalities of the bill. That's your job. Mine is to give you a vision where one day, this is my dream in South Africa. You will say, why do I wake up every day? I wake up every day so that that number of 23% or 40% of black and colored South Africans who constitute the fifth quintile or the lowest quintile, let us reverse that. Let us reverse that. This is not to make white South Africans poorer. No. I want everyone to earn more. But my fundamental interest is that the middle quintile, those middle ones, 2 and 3, must be the largest section of our population. We're never going to have too many super wealthy people. That's a unfair income distribution. But South Africa's biggest problem is that we've got too many people who are poor. So let's fair pay. Because then when we do that, we can restore dignity. We can ensure that people can get to and from work. We can give people the right to choose what they're going to do. But also, we can as a society realize what income means. The other day, my wife and I were going out to a function. I was speaking at this function and I needed to get a babysitter. Now, when you are looking for a babysitter, it's an interesting question, really. Because you have to look for someone, you look for someone who could look after your kids as best as you can. So now we ask a number of people to talk to us. Eventually we land at this young girl. She must be 20, blonde haired, great, shows up. I'm not saying that's competence, I'm just telling you who she is. She arrives at our house, fair enough. We say, okay, fine, now we're leaving. I say to her, we'll be away for 5 hours. How much do we pay? My wife tells me, she said, no, it's about 120 rand an hour. Now, yeah, that doesn't sound like a lot of money, right? But for 5 hours of work, that's 600 rand, something like that. Yeah? So we just pay her that because that's what it is. And then the thought struck me. I said, a babysitter came to my house for 4 hours. I paid her 600 rands. I wonder how many South Africans would consider the work of a domestic worker in the same light. Because a domestic worker must earn less relative to someone who is babysitting. A domestic worker. I hear people proudly say themselves, to now we pay our domestic worker 4,000. 3,000, so 3,000. The median wage in the country is about 4,600, somewhere there. So it's fascinating for me that when we think about domestic workers, we ask them to do the same, look after kids. Sometimes we ask them to cook. Sometimes we ask them to cook, clean, and look after the kids. But their rate per hour is not 120 rands. I can tell you for gratis. Is that fair wage? It's unfair. It's patently unfair. My argument is simple. If you want fair bill, fair pay, have it across all sectors. And make sure that the babysitter who comes at night to look after the children is compensated in the same way, or if the domestic worker does the same work, they must be compensated the same. So fellow South Africans, today is that advancement of that struggle. This bill is crucial for now. It's critical that we get this right. Because our economy, when you look at South Africa from the economy of the wealthy, you would say, of course, inflation targeting makes sense. The monetary policy of the government makes sense. You would say that. But when you look at it from the perspective of the poor, who many of them are food insecure, this has got implications for them. So someone who's living in the upper bound poverty level is earning only 790 rand per month. Household income. It means that person every month has to make a choice between food or clothing. Guys, this is... So when we applaud during the budget speech and we say, halala, SRD has gone from 350 to 370. What's a child grant? We applaud. Those are welfare interventions. I'm just talking about what we remunerate people for. We have to do better. We have to ask ourselves, are we advancing freedom? So let me challenge you today, those of you who will be working on this, is that the bill needs your input. It needs your story. And I want to thank every South African who's soldiered hard to bring this bill to our table. This is not a political mission. Someone said to me, hey, but my money, you say, hey, you've changed your tune, man. Hey, hey. Maybe I've just become a little bit more aware of what happens when someone has to boil leaves to stop a child from crying out of hunger. Maybe I've just become all too aware of what multi-dimensional poverty looks like. See, poverty isn't just not having food. Poverty could equally not being able to gain access to a school, as I found in the Eastern Cape recently, where children have to walk. The headmaster said to me, on average, between 8 to 10 kilometers per day to get to school. Now, there's a context behind that. Because the Eastern Cape is a vast province, and of course, people have to be transported. But just imagine for yourself, even if you had to walk, I have taken up running, and look. But the facts are, that's like doing 5 kilometers every day, 10 kilometers to and from school. On the day it rains, I'm not going to school. On the day it's cold, I'm not going to school. That's a different form of poverty. I was at Frere Hospital in the Eastern Cape, where I discovered quite quickly that this is the central hospital. That for many people, they can't gain access to that hospital because they just live far. We talk about cerebral palsy, and it just rolls off the tongue when we talk about medical legal cases. And I'll tell you what happens for somebody to sometimes get cerebral palsy. I was at Baragwanath Hospital. They said to me, if we can get the child who's oxygen deprived, in essence, there's distress when the mother is giving birth. If we can get them to the hospital in less than 6 hours, we can intervene. Yet today, young people and children, because they can't get to the nearest hospital which can give them help in less than 6 hours, you are ending up with increased medical legal claims on one level. At another level, you have many people who suffer cerebral palsy because of oxygen deprivation at birth. Seriously, when we talk about poverty, let's talk about justice. So, fellow South Africans, today, don't see it just as a technical response to a bill. Don't see it simply as amending this or amending that. See it as an act of justice. Because let it be that one day when somebody applies for an opportunity to get a job, we can remunerate them fairly. And I know many people will argue, experience. I say, I hear the experience argument. I hear it. And it's within a band, right? It's always within a band. But never shall it be that someone can use historical injustice to perpetuate future injustices. So I leave you again with the words of Nelson Mandela when he said, we pledge ourselves to liberate all our people from continuing bondage of poverty, deprivation, suffering, gender, and other discrimination. Let freedom reign. Thank you.
Absolutely incredible. Thank you, Honorable Maimani, for those potent words. I realize that I asked you to paint a picture of the emotional and social cost of unfair pay. And what I didn't realize that as you painted the picture, we are all in the picture. And now it is up to us. Do we like the picture? Do we want to change the picture? Because now we have the opportunity to do so. So thank you, sir, for reminding us that the aim is to liberate, for reminding us that we need laws that liberate, and all of us can see the shackles on the baby. All of us can see the shackles caused by salary history, and we need to take the shackles off. Keywords from your contribution: justice, 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 and more justice. I like that. Fairness and dignity, a call to restore. And I don't know about you, but I want to say yes already. Earlier on, team, I had a video that I'm so keen to show everybody. And the reason is we get to hear one of us say it in his own words, right? Not theorizing, but explain the story of what he went through. If you can give me a thumbs up, if you can play that video, I'd be so excited for us to just zoom in on that and hear an individual who was part of really the start of the campaign on being paid fair in his own words. So let's turn our eyes to the screen and receive that openly.
And we're here to meet a young man who would not be put down. He took what was a painful experience for him and made sure that nobody ever has to suffer that injustice again. His idea is set to revolutionize the look and feel of corporate South Africa. Let's go and meet him.
This is Patuxolo Maqavana, the brains behind what is now known as the Fair Pay Bill, a bill that seeks to end income inequality by eradicating the requirement for potential employees to produce their previous payslip in salary negotiations, and calling for the employer to disclose upfront what every position is worth. For years, Patu approached various political parties to lobby Parliament on his behalf until he found a kindred spirit in Build One South Africa.
Patu, it's been about a year since you and I met on social media, and you actually brought that to my attention. I didn't realize, but looking back, I'm like, oh my gosh, you're right. Tell me a little bit about where you were at in terms of your thinking and what made you think, I think I need to approach Bosa with this baby of mine. And I call it your baby because you've nursed it for so long.
Yeah, thank you, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was about 29th of June or thereabout. You had actually posted on your profile about, citizens coming to Build One South Africa and proposing the kind of initiatives and things that they would like to change or improve about South Africa. And I thought to myself, hey, this works. This is complementary. Let's give it a shot.
And the rest, as they say, is history. Patu took his own pain in corporate and used it for a greater purpose.
I think personally, all I sought to do was to better myself and to better my family. But unfortunately, this hampered my growth, right? In that I asked myself, what does my past pay have to do with the current job that I'm doing and the responsibilities that I have? And I just recall at that time that instead of getting the assistance that I was looking for to help me understand the reason for the difference in pay, it was simply, just evading, and then ultimately I learned that the reason for this was because my colleague's past pay slip or her pay in a previous position was higher than mine. Therefore, that's how they justified the difference in pay. However, if one looked at what I was doing and certainly my contribution to the company, it far superseded her, and I honestly felt a sense of hurt. I asked myself, why does my past need to follow me wherever I go?
He says with South Africa's history, we must be intentional about transformation and equality.
Everybody, because the reality is that a lot of us don't have the connections when we post-university. We go to university, we don't have the connections to get into corporate, and likely it is that we find work either informally or let's say as retail workers, which are low paying jobs and therefore would have a lower pay slip. And so when you then go to a company and that company then bases the pay on, let's say as an example, you're earning 2,500 there, right? But they know the position that and the responsibilities that you have here. This job has been measured and benchmarked to say this job should be paying 20,000, but by asking that payslip of 2,500, you'll actually put me maybe at 10,000 and then pocket the difference and save the difference. And then only later I find out, or a person can find out, that they have a colleague in the same level, same experience, same responsibilities, maybe even doing more than that person, but that person earning more only on the basis of the past payslip.
Having given Bossa a clear mandate, his request is simple.
So what we're asking Parliament to do is to please do the right thing. It's clearly there in the preamble of both the Constitution and the Employment Equity Act. Please give workers equality of pay, dignity, and ultimately, if people are earning as they should be earning, they have more to spend, and this could only be good for the economy, right?
Part 2 asks, why must my past follow me? Painful words, and truly I also ask, why must our past follow us? We're going to shift gears now. We're going to move from personal story to politics, because we also learned that politics affects the people. So at some point we need to speak to that. So we're shifting gears from lived experience to legislative reform. And I'd like to invite on the podium the woman I think can do this best, because she comes from a journey where that has been shaped, yes, by the lived experiences, and she's seen, experienced, and heard the gaps in empowerment policy. And as a former business and civil society advocate herself, and now legislator sponsoring the bill, it is essential for us to hear from Honorable Nobuntu Hlazo Webster. If you can help me welcome her to the podium as she speaks to us.
Nande says we're shifting from the personal to politics, but politics is personal. Good morning, everybody. Good morning to the various stakeholders that are here. Good morning to the civil society partners that are here, social partners. I know that there's members of organized labor. We have business representatives that are here, civil society leaders, and we have fellow South Africans that are in the room and that are online. I want to say a very good morning to you, and we have members of the media. A very good morning to you. Welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to be here today and to be with us and to actually be part of crafting what we believe is an important and integral bill in South Africa. I want to, first of all, acknowledge Phathukolo Maqavana, because there is a political slogan that we often use, Amandla awethu. We use it all the time. If I say right now, Amandla, you'll say awethu, because it is so common and we know it so well. And it has become something that kind of unites us as a people. But how often do we actually live that out? How often do we live out the reality that power actually is our hands in a country like South Africa with a democratic constitution and democratic institutions that can actually allow and give mechanisms for that to be true? We're here in Parliament as parliamentarians because we represent the people. And so the power ultimately that lives in these walls, that lives through the processes of legislation in this country, actually sits because we receive a mandate from the people. The power that we have to legislate, the power that we have to amend laws, the power that sits within the framework of our constitution should never, ever, ever only rest in the hands of politicians. Politicians should merely be serving and representing the interests of the people. And in that way, power is in the hands of the people. And I hope that the name of Phathukolo Maqavana will be one that we remember and one that we acknowledge and one that we celebrate as a reminder of the fact that power is in our hands, and we actually do have power as South Africans. Last week, we saw what happened with the gender-based violence shutdown. Another reminder of the power that we have as South Africans. And so I just wanted to start with that reminder. If we're talking politics and legislation, we cannot talk politics and legislation without talking about the power of South Africans and the power of people and their power to be able to make sure that their lived experience is represented and accounted for in the laws that exist in this country. And so in the process that was championed and had been championed and labored by Phathukolo Maqavana, we then partnered with him as Build One South Africa, as those who would be sponsoring the bill. And so even as Build One South Africa, as we sponsor this bill, even as I, as a legislator, then introduce the bill into Parliament, I do so at the back of my mind, knowing that there's a full circle that has taken place, that there is a South African who had an experience, that there is a movement, an organization, civil society, that then included various actors and players that then took the movement on, and then it ultimately then ends at the political and with legislation. And we must always be aware of that circle, because that is how the circle of democracy should be working. I want to share what, in the process then of engaging various stakeholders, we found that has been consistent and that has been a pattern as we've engaged various players when it comes to the issue of pay. And that has been that, first of all, pay secrecy hides unfairness. Pay secrecy is a tool to mask and to hide unfairness and, dare I say, injustice. The second is that unequal pay between genders, races, and any employees actually exists more than we realize. That is the second. It exists. There is unequal pay for people who are doing the same job. In many instances, people who have the same experience and same qualifications in South Africa. Thirdly, and this is the most, for me, this is the most significant, because it speaks to our very, very painful history in South Africa. The third is that salary history traps people into the disadvantages of their past. If you start off on the back foot, you spend your life trying to play catch up. I once, as a social justice engagement, or at a social justice engagement some years ago, was asked to play a game of Monopoly. I think you've played that game of Monopoly. I can see your smile. And in this game of Monopoly, we were in teams. And there were some teams at the start that were given money, houses, hotels. There were teams that were given a little bit of money, a little bit of houses, a little bit of hotels. And then there were teams that were given nothing. I happened to have been on the team that was given nothing. We played this game. We rolled the dice, and it just so happened that every time I rolled the dice, I was rolling doubles, rolling doubles, rolling doubles. But no matter how much I kept rolling doubles, I could not catch up with the ones that already had the hotels, with the ones that already had the money, with the ones that already had the houses. I found myself crying in the middle of a Monopoly game because as a Black woman in South Africa, I could relate. That no matter how brilliant I am, the sixes, the doubles, no matter how hard I work, they have been systemic realities that have meant I just can't catch up in a generation. And so that is the third. That salary history is amongst one of those things that traps people in previous disadvantage. And I'll share a little bit of my personal story just now, because like I said, politics is personal. It's at least personal for me. I'm in politics because of a personal story. I'm in politics because of personal experiences. It's personal. So I want to say that this bill exists because of experiences by South Africans, because of realities, because of a system that isn't delivering fairness on its own, needs an intervention. And I want to say to detractors, and I've been on a few interviews, on one debate in particular that debated this very bill. It was, I think, on NCA, where detractors on that platform, detractors in various other media platforms have argued that this is an interference in the marketplace. It is by no means an interference in the marketplace. It's Parliament doing what it is mandated to do by setting minimum standards and actually safeguarding equality and the dignity of people. So I mentioned earlier that this is personal because politics is personal. And I started off my career, Nandi's mentioned I have a career in business, I have a career leading business associations, advocacy associations, as well as being a business person myself. And I want to mention that, and I often mention that because I know there's business in the room and there's business online, and the assumption is that there isn't an understanding of what bills like this or laws like this, of the consequence or the impact they can have on businesses. I do so being a business owner and having been a business owner for a long time. But I also do so leading an organization. At the end of the day, political parties are organizations that employ people. I do so leading an organization and having to apply this very law, this very bill in my own organization. And so this is not from ignorance. This is from somebody who then ultimately has to say to my team, you guys are allowed to share your salaries with each other. I have to say that. And they're here, they're in the room. I have to be able to say to them, to HR in our organization, in Build One South Africa itself, from now on, every single advert that comes out has a salary bracket. And we've implemented that. And so this doesn't come from a place of ignorance or a place that is not impacted by what this changes. It comes from a place of knowing that equality and justice is an imperative. And so I've experienced pay secrecy before I was in business, I was in corporate. And I came into corporate at a time where these very laws we speak about, employment equity, had just been introduced. And so as a young woman, young Black woman, I'll say it fine, as an intelligent, as an intelligent and brilliant young Black woman, the opportunities were suddenly many because employment equity had to be achieved. But in one of the places of employment I was in, where I was actually in a matter of months, moving up the ranks quite fast, I realized that in conversations that took place, regardless of the load of work that kept increasing for me, because of course now I'm the superstar who's going up fast, there are individuals with whom we do the same work, individuals where we have the same qualifications, to some extent, higher qualifications, what I would have, but they're getting paid more than me. And we're doing the same job. And you see, the issue became that that was not something that I could raise. That was not something that I could challenge, because our contract stipulated that you are not to discuss your salary. It's a clause in the contract. And so by challenging the status quo, it would mean, first of all, I risk myself being fired, having my contract terminated, because I've broken or I've breached a clause in the contract, but I then expose others who've done the same by sharing what their pay is. And so I've experienced pay secrecy. I've experienced the unfairness of not being able to challenge pay secrecy. And I've also then been in advocacy in associations where, in the Businesswomen's Association as an example, where I was chairperson, in the Youth Chamber of Commerce that I chaired, you have individuals that come up to you, young people, women, who say there's this issue happening at work where I'm not getting paid the same. There's pay secrecy. I'm not getting paid the same as my colleagues, where we have the same qualifications, where we have the same experience. I'm not getting paid the same. And it has been based, obviously, on your pay history. And so today, we're then here. And these same concerns have come many years later, might I add. And now I'm experiencing it as a legislator. And so I want to, again, draw on the importance of this full circle that we need to experience, that we need to use as a mechanism to say it must start from the experience of a citizen. It must then move into a place of advocacy. Because you know what that does? It tests the collective experience. It tests the fact that, is this just an individual experience? Or are there others? Is this a collective injustice? And that is important. So it is important that there's an experience of a citizen. It then moves to the place of advocacy. So it receives collective voices. So it has collective engagement. So you know that it is a collective and shared injustice, but advocacy isn't enough. It then needs to find its way to legislation. It needs to find its way to law. And so that's why law matters, ultimately. I then have two more things that I want to talk about before I sit down. The second is that we have to situate this bill, even as we engage it today, as different players in society. We have to situate this bill within South Africa's empowerment journey, right? We have what I call first generation empowerment. And this is post 94. And these are laws that were fundamentally about access. And it is good work that was done. It's the employment equity laws, broad-based Black economic empowerment, those frameworks, first generation empowerment laws. And they are about access. And we must acknowledge them, and good work has been done to create access, a foot in the door. But access alone is incomplete. I always say that access gets you into the door, but equity determines what you can do once you're inside. And for too many South Africans, once they're inside the room, they encounter opaque pay structures. They encounter salary history bias. They encounter entrenched power imbalances, and that maintains inequality. That's just in the workplace. In the place and in the realm of business, there are also other inequalities that actually exist once you have that access. So I urge us to, even this morning, consider this bill through three lenses. First lens is a justice lens. Access is formal equality. Equity, though, is substantive equality. That is the ability to not just enter, but to thrive. The second that I want us to look at is an economic justice lens. Markets cannot allocate fairly when information is hidden. So fair bargaining becomes impossible without transparency. And that's the economic justice lens that we need to look at. And lastly, the socio-economic justice lens. And that is the fact that salary history drags, or the practice of having to disclose salary history drags the disadvantages of the past into the opportunities for the future. It's a quiet continuation, actually, of historical inequality. That's ultimately what it is. And so we must evolve from that first generation access framework to a second generation equity framework. And this is what this bill seeks to do. The status quo exists really because of the issue of transparency, of salary history, but most important, and I mentioned this when I shared my personal story, the absence of recourse. When you're there now and you've discovered that, okay, there are unfair salary practices happening now, because there isn't a legal framework, you have no recourse. And because in some instances, it's contained even in your own contractual engagement with an organization, you do not have recourse. And so that is ultimately where the areas that we need to be challenging today are. So we're not alone in recognizing this, because the United States, California, New York, Massachusetts have banned employers from asking job applicants about previous salaries. In the United Kingdom, companies with 250 or more employees have to publish annual gender pay gap data. In Canada, Pay equity legislation ensures that employees doing substantially similar work receive equal pay. In Australia, employers with 100+ employees must report on gender equality indicators, and this includes pay. And across the European Union, pay transparency existed as a directive that requires employers to provide equal pay for equal work and enable actually pay audits and allow employees to request information. So these examples show us that law can actively reshape fairness in the labor markets, and that there can be transparency for equity, inclusion, and dignity. And so, lastly, as we go into this engagement, I want to assure you that this is not a defensive exercise. We're not here to justify the bill. We are here to improve it. We're here to hear your expertise, your concerns, the realities in your own day-to-day work. And we ask you today, the ask is that we strengthen it. The ask is that you flag any practical or legal risks that may arise from its implementation. So your input will guide the amendments, inform even the committee's deliberations as we come in, and as I will be going actually into the portfolio committee for employment and labor and presenting this bill. It means that it will guide those deliberations as well. And in closing, I want to remind us of what I started with. This bill, as Nande pointed out right in the beginning, is not originated by BOSA. It is originated by a South African citizen. It is originated by a collective of South African citizens that had various expertise and various experiences. It is being sponsored and legislated by Build One South Africa. It is a reminder of how democracy should be working. And more than anything, we have a generation that fought for the freedom and democracy of our country. We stand on their shoulders. We applaud them. We celebrate them. But now we've got to do our work. We have got to move into the next layer, into the next generation of laws that move us from a place of access and truly move us towards a place of equity, a place of equality, a place of truly shared prosperity in our country. Thank you.
At the risk of, I know the youth will get this, at the risk of sounding like an ambulance and going, wow, wow, wow. Wow, wow, wow. Thank you so much, Honorable Hlazo Webster. We receive even the correction that the political is actually personal. We understand that all right in the room, and I enjoy that you put on us lens so we can see and chart forward with clarity. You put on that socio-economic justice lens beautifully on us. And I believe that we are on the same page. And when you say amandla, and a few of us responded in a way too, I actually want to get a feel of the room. Remember earlier, it's many things that you remember from earlier, but earlier I spoke to you about a QR code, and Dr. Maimani was impressed that we are QR coding. This is your opportunity. I want to get a feel of the room, of where you're at, where your mind is at, where your heart is at. And if you go on the link that we would have saved on your browser, the team is going to queue up some questions. It's just 4 questions that you can answer honestly. There is no need to input your name. We are here as villagers to make sure this baby thrives healthily in the workplace. So contribute your insights, contribute your expertise. If you weren't in the room earlier, there it is. Scan, if you open your camera and focus it towards the pattern, a link will come up, which you can go to, right? I'm gonna ask 4 questions for you to contribute so we can get a feel of the room and we can exercise the power that we actually have to shape this baby into the thriving, walking, living reality as we move from access to equity. I'm enjoying the morning because we are being equipped with language, right? A lot in society, in business, in our families is normalized through language. Even when people who don't know much are resisting, you can go with language. You can say, but what I understand. And so I'm enjoying the morning for that reason. Are we winning? Are you getting the questions? Are you popping them in? That's good. I'm going to check those and throughout the day, say back to you what you are saying to us. As Honorable Nobuntu said, pay secrecy hides unfairness and injustice. I think the time for hidden work is over. Let's make the words and feels and thoughts public, all the insights public as we journey together in the broader journey of economic justice and restoring dignity. And yeah, some questions there relating to how you understand the problem. That's good. We're going to name the wound and bind the wound together so you can rate there your understanding. And I believe it's 4 questions. Thank you for that contribution. I'm going to get 2 important speakers to contribute now. We will have a comfort break and tea and water and come back, and then we take it to the floor. But before that, before we engage as a floor and people, before we flag some of the responses from earlier, I want to understand the definitions in this bill. I want to understand what is in there and what is not. I want to understand what the bill actually does. I want to understand the legal framework. So it's important for us to receive the core framework of what it is. Hear some specific clauses, if we may, from our legal team. Some specific clauses and are there gaps, is there input needed? So we can refine it together, better it together. So we'll hear the key provisions and how they identify the pain that we've heard being articulated so beautifully throughout the morning. Do you know, I am realizing in real time that I need glasses. I'm realizing in real time, but the awareness of a problem is the start. I will need to get actual glasses to be able to see far. Remuneration transparency is one of the questions. That's great. You can take your time on that and select. I'm enjoying the different types of questions. Allow for variety then. Team, as you put those together for me, I'll feedback, but at this moment, we are going to hear from the lawyers, the legal partners who can speak specifics to the law. We've got Nikki Moodley in the building with us in person, which is fantastic. I enjoy that. And we've got Mudzuli Rakivane presenting online. So there's that dynamic that's beautiful. I enjoy that we've got people in the room and people online, but everyone on the same journey. Ladies, are you ready to present to us the specifics, the definitions, what the bill does, what it does not do, and empower us with that? Could you help me welcome to the podium our legal partners? Yes. Feel like you're getting smarter and smarter, but just you coming closer to me. Welcome, Nikki.
Partners and colleagues, thank you so much for the opportunity to address you today. We've had some really powerful human stories this morning. My contribution is slightly different. I really want to locate the bill briefly in our legal framework to respond as well to some of the anxieties around this bill. And to show what we're doing here is really part of kind of a wider global movement and a step towards realizing the promise of the Employment Equity Act. Before I do that, though, I really do want to take this opportunity to acknowledge someone who has worked incredibly hard on drafting of this bill together with our parliamentary team, but as the person who has carried this bill, Advocate Nadine Fourie. She joins us online. She has carried this bill on a pro bono basis alongside a really heavy labor practice where she sees every day where our current framework is not working. She does not only see the theory, she sees the case files, she sees the frustrated workers, she sees the frustrated employers, and she has drafted this bill with two things in mind. One, is it justiciable? And will it work in the real world? That is the real world of interviews, of pay slips, of payrolls, of the hiring desk. So her work, together with the living experience brought by Patu and others, is the reason that we actually have a credible bill before us. So thank you, Nadine. I know you're watching online. Legally, this is a private member's bill, and you're going to hear more about that from our parliamentary lawyer. It did not come from a minister or a department. It came from a South African who was actually just tired of being underpaid, who went and found some allies, and then found a member of parliament willing to carry the proposal. It's also not a brand new bill. It is a short, focused amendment to the Employment Equity Act. And it is a law that translates our constitutional right to equality, dignity, and fair labor practices into rules in the workplace. The preamble of the Employment Equity Act is very clear. It recognizes that because of apartheid and other discriminatory laws, there are deep disparities in employment, occupation, and income, and that those disparities cannot be redressed simply by repealing discriminatory laws. That is actually Parliament talking to itself there. Yet we still have this kind of denialism that we are hearing, which is quite common at the moment for us at BOSO. We're hearing, oh, well, apartheid's over, you know. We hear the market will sort itself out. Don't worry. We also hear this a lot. Stop interfering with business. The very act we are amending tells us that that is not good enough. There are still gaps in our framework, and this bill is one of the modest tools that we need to close those gaps. From a legal perspective, the gap is quite specific. Our system deals with it, well, our system actually deals really well with discrimination once you're inside the workplace. It does not regulate clearly how unfair pay is carried from job to job through salary history, or how pay secrecy prevents workers from ever actually discovering that they're underpaid. So asking for pay slips and pegging offers to past earnings, it does actually sound fairly neutral, but it's not neutral. It's not neutral in a country where Black people, women, young people, and persons with disabilities are systematically underpaid, and they still are. It's important, I think, to stress that we are actually not the first country to see this problem. or to come up with a solution. So comparative research for this bill shows a really clear global trend away from salary history reliance and towards pay transparency. A growing number of US states, such as California, Colorado, New York, Massachusetts, Delaware, Nevada, and Washington, have all banned or tightly restricted salary history questions and required employers to disclose salary ranges for vacancies. At federal law, the United States has limited the use of salary history for its own federal contractors. In the United Kingdom, government has piloted pay transparency measures. And in Australia, what's going on with the lights? It's getting dingy. And in Australia, major corporates have voluntarily abandoned salary history questions because they actually just on their own have really recognized how they perpetuate gender and race pay gaps. These developments are backed by international law. South Africa has ratified the ILO's Equal Remuneration Convention, which requires that pay be based on the objective appraisal of the job, which is the work to be performed, rather than on biased or historical factors. Around the world, salary history bans and pay transparency rules are increasingly seen as practical tools for giving effect to that principle. In that sense, the Fair Pay Bill is not only morally justifiable, it helps us to live up to our commitments that we have already made on an international level. Let me also say a word about what this bill is not, because many of the criticisms that we have heard confuse it with much bigger debates. Firstly, this is not a new triple B style scorecard. It is not an attempt to micromanage business. There are no points, there are no quotas, there's no new regulator, there's no new tribunal. The bill lives inside the Employment Equity Act and relies on the same institutions, labor inspectors, the CCMA and the Labor Court. It does not tell any employers what the right salary is for the job. It deals with how offers are made and how transparency and how transparent pay is. That's quite as simple as it gets. Secondly, it does not outlaw it does not outlaw merit or performance-based pay. Employers will still be able to differentiate based on experience, qualification, performance, and scarce skills. What they will not be able to do if this bill passes is to justify paying someone less purely because they started at a lower base in a different job, in a different town, at a different point in our history. The details of how the bill gives effect to these principles, the mechanisms around salary history, recruitment transparency, the protection of pay discussions, and how it interacts with the EEA, the BCEA, which is the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, and the Labor Relations Act, will be unpacked by our next speaker, Muds, who's online. My task is simply to underline the bigger picture here. In that big picture, the bill does three things. It takes promises already written into our laws, in the Constitution, in the Employment Equity Act, and in our international commitments, and it makes them more real at the point where many careers are decided, which is actually at the hiring table. It aligns South Africa with the global movement, and it reminds us that we cannot talk about leaving apartheid behind while leaving in place the legacy of apartheid era mechanisms that keeps its wage patterns alive. So I will hand over to Mudzuli, who joins us online, to really take you through the nuts and bolts, Section A and Section B of the Employment Equity Act. Thank you, Muds.
Thank you, Nikki. That was incredible. And thank you for laying the foundations of what we're going to discuss now. I just want to triple check that everybody can hear me clearly and can see my screen, because I will be sharing my screen shortly. Can I get some sort of indication from the room?
Thumbs up.
Yes, okay, perfect. Okay, good morning, everyone. I was introduced earlier, the role that I'll be playing today will be to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the bill itself, which I believe everybody has a copy of. I am joined online by, as Nikki had mentioned, Nadine Fourie, who is an advocate, who was the primary drafter of the bill, is also on this call. And as Nikki had acknowledged, the significant amount of work that she has put into it alongside Patu. So that is some of the people who are available. What I'm going to be doing is speaking to some of the technicalities of the bill. And by the end of my session, I believe there will be a short break. And then after that, we will open up a floor discussion on specifically the technicalities of the bill. And I'd like to also just set the tone for that engagement. I think Nobuntu had very clearly said that this is not intended to be an adversarial space in terms of the drafters of the bill versus detractors, nor is it necessarily a platform for sort of BOSA to defend this bill to its death. Instead, what this is an opportunity for BOSA and those involved in the process of the bill to share as much information as possible in order for all the stakeholders representing various sectors of society to ask questions, to make contributions. Whether or not those are in favor or against the bill is irrelevant. But what is relevant is whether or not these contributions can ultimately lead to the bettering of the technical aspects of the bill, as Nande had set up, that this is about testing sort of how it's going to live in society, and then also to ensure that the process that follows from today's engagement is one that is that everyone can participate in as much as possible, because there is a very clear understanding from BOSA as the sponsor of this bill that BOSA in and of itself will not be able to pass this bill alone, nor will the drafters, and it is going to require everybody in this room and their spheres of influence to get this bill over the line in its best condition possible. So with that background in mind, I'm going to share my screen so that we can do an exercise of going through the bill in its written form. Some of this might seem very primary or very, I should have actually checked if I have sharing capabilities. I believe I do. Okay, that will come up shortly. Some of this might seem very sort of primary to some of you in the room in terms of how we go through this line by line, but I also don't want to take for granted that everybody necessarily understands how to read a bill. And that everyone has actually read the bill itself. So this is to make sure that we all are actually aware of the words used in the bill and how it is structured. And then once we're able to sort of cover that ground, we can get into sort of the nitty-gritty and the details of that. Okay, so I believe everyone has a copy in front of them of the bill. It is called the Employment Equity Amendment Bill because, as my colleague Nikki had put forward earlier, that it is an amendment to the Employment Equity Act. It is not a new sort of standalone law in and of itself. So we're dealing with an amendment bill. You will see then at the top there, we have a general explanatory note, which just tells you in 1 or 2 lines what this bill is doing. So again, to repeat, this is amending the Employment Equity Act of 1998, and it's basically achieves 2 purposes. It amends and inserts new definitions, which we will go through, and then it also introduces 2 new components, and that is contained in Section 6A and Section 6B, which we will then unpack. So that is the general format of what this act is achieving. It's amending the Employment Equity Act through 2 scopes, essentially through amending and adding some new definitions, and then also adding new components through Section 6A and 6B. I'm going to start with Sections 6A and 6B, and then as we sort of unpack those 2 sections, then we're going to also touch on some of those definitions. when we do the engagement, there are some things I am going to flag sort of as a, I'm going to flag early on as a basis for the discussion when we come back from the tea break, because I do think that some of these smaller issues are things that might be particularly interesting for the people from Labour, from people who are maybe lawyers in the Labour space when it comes to why decisions were made on certain words. The other thing I'd like to say is that some of you might have seen the first version of this bill. So just a quick explanation on that. On the 16th of June this year, I believe, BOSA had submitted its first draft of the bill to Parliament. And part of that parliamentary process, which I believe Daksha is going to go into later, is there then ensues a process between the sponsor of the bill and the legal team of Parliament, whereby they come back with specific comments or suggestions on either removing certain aspects or adding certain aspects or changing certain technical aspects of the bill. That process had begun on June 16, and the consequence now of that process is that we now have a second version of the bill. So some of you have been incredibly proactive, which has been great, in submitting some comments already on the first version of the bill. So if there are certain components of the bill which look different to you now, or that are different from the first version you've seen, please be aware that this is version 2.0 of the bill that was submitted or that you might have seen from the original bill of June 16. Okay. So let's sort of get into the two components of what this bill is amending. As was explained earlier, it is incredibly short and incredibly focused because given just the vast scope of how much labor laws we have in South Africa and how much labor-related issues we have, this can go in 1,000 different directions. And it's even been important as the law sort of drafters here to exercise incredible amounts of restraint to keep this really focused in terms of achieving these two objectives. So the first one we will see in 6A, which deals with the promotion of remuneration transparency, is that firstly, the bill requires that an employer must, when conducting job classification, grading, or evaluation, determine the remuneration or, if necessary, a remuneration range for each position, taking into account Section 6.4 and any criteria and methodology prescribed in terms of Section 6.5. When advertising a position, recruiting for a position, or considering the appointment, promotion, or transfer of an employee, disclose the remuneration or, where applicable, the remuneration range for the position. And lastly, on request, provide an employee with the remuneration range for a job or position in which they are currently employed, or with the remuneration or remuneration range for a job or position for which they wish to apply. Each employee has the right to discuss a job offer remuneration range for a position with another employee. So a lot of what's contained in this particular Section 6A, you would have heard examples of through the personal stories shared by the speakers before me. So you would have heard Nobuntu speak to the issue in her experience of contractually not being allowed to ask other colleagues how much they're being paid. And that might seem like a silly little clause in a contract, but those dynamics are what then keep the sort of perpetuation of pay secrecy going, particularly in corporate South Africa. So that's just one example of how this act, or this bill rather, is trying to take those lived experiences which perpetuate sort of pay secrecy, which can perpetuate pay discrimination, and find expression in it in the law. Because while the Employment Equity Act and other labor-related acts, speak broadly to issues of fair pay and transparency and non-discrimination. What this particular bill is seeking to do is to particularly legislate for that, so that it closes those little loopholes which are prevalent in the job sort of environment at the time, or at the moment. So just to sort of go clause by clause now and sort of unpack what those three sort of distinct situations are in section 6A1 and then section 6A2. The first is, I think, sort of what the most, or maybe we start with B, because then we can sort of work back to the back end of it. So the classic example of what B is trying to deal with is you go on LinkedIn, you go online, and I am searching for a job. I am young and I am a job seeker because I am representative of the sort of the biggest group of unemployed people in South Africa at the moment. And I find this amazing job and I see I'm qualified for it and I am really keen. I'm hitting sort of all the right aspects of it. It's in the right city and I'm keen to apply now. But what you will find, and I think there might be examples in your information pack of actual screenshots of this, because some of the comments that have come from even other members of parliament on this quite informally has been, well, this is not a real problem, or this is a solution without a problem. And I'm unable to see the room right now, but if I were to sort of take a test, I think there'd be a lot of you in the room who have seen a job which lists the specific words that they use when it comes to what the pay will be. We'll use words like market related pay, or once candidates have reached a certain stage of the recruitment process, pay will then be, the pay range or the scope will be discussed. Or some of it is just blank. Some adverts just don't even talk about pay in the advertisement process. So what this law is particularly, what this particular section is trying to get at is, when you are advertising a position or recruiting for a position or considering the appointment, and these are all very distinct processes, as you can see. It's not just to cover advertising, but it is to just particularly cover different stages of a recruitment process, or a process of appointment or promotion or transfer of an employee. Disclose the remuneration, or where applicable, the remuneration range of a position. And I want to also talk to the distinction of advertising a position and, as we see sort of further down the line, the promotion or transfer of an employee. This is very specifically included in this process, because pay discrimination can happen at any stage of a person's career. And that becomes really important to who this bill is speaking to. It's not just speaking to the person, a young person entering the job market for the first time, because that's an obvious sort of place of potential exploitation, especially in sort of the unemployment crisis of South Africa today, where you could easily make the argument to say, well, instead, young people must just be happy that they're getting a job. And when we legislate at this level and we put more restrictions or more laws in place, then we're stifling that environment as well. And I'm glad that this discussion was prefaced on the basis of justice, because unemployment cannot be solved by exploitative employment. That's not the goal over here. An unemployment crisis the answer to that should not be let's employ people, but let's exploit them, and they should just be happy to be receiving a job. So that's why this particular bill speaks to that kind of, or that part of engagement. But then it also takes things a little further and looks at the fact that, well, if I'm listening to this engagement and I've been working, for example, in corporate South Africa for the last 15 years, I might be, and I don't plan on changing my job, I might be feeling like, well, I'm just trapped. And the sort of cycle of discrimination that I've faced in the past, because I know I submitted my pay slip when I was a bright-eyed and bushy-tailed 22-year-old, and I just know I'm being underpaid, but the bill can't help me. It specifically then speaks to other aspects of where you are on your journey. So, for example, if you are up for promotion or transfer, then there's an opportunity over there for some of those corrections to happen at that level, and for there to be fairness with regards to that process. Because I think, again, if you've worked in the labor market for long enough, you know that there's so many unfair practices that even happen at the stage of promotion and transfer, of an employee. So I just wanted to highlight that it is not repetitive. It is very intentional that particularly Section 1B and other aspects of the bill speak to the different stages of either recruitment, of advertising, or other parts where remuneration becomes part of the discussion in the workplace. And then we sort of have a very important catch-all at C. So on request, provide an employee with a remuneration range for a job or position in which they are currently employed. Because again, that speaks to, well, I'm already in the system. And so if I'm not sort of in the process of being promoted or transferred, or I'm not looking for a new position, am I screwed? And the answer to that is no, because what this is then aiming to do is sort of do a cleanup exercise for people who are already existing in positions in the labor sort of force. And so that just again says that on request, provide an employee with a remuneration range for a job or position in which they are currently employed, or with a remuneration range for a job position for which they wish to apply. Now, I think it's important at this stage for us to go into the definition section and speak about what remuneration or remuneration range means. And this is a particularly important insertion because it is also a place where we have had multiple discussions, and we've actually already seen it in the US. So they're a couple of steps ahead of South Africa in this stage. I mean, on this aspect, because they have seen now it's not just enough to say that you must disclose a range, but they've also seen some exploitative practices in the disclosure range section. So if we go up to the definitions and we go to range, you will see there at J. By insertion, after the definition of remuneration information or of the following definition, remuneration range means the range of remuneration that the employer currently pays for a position or reasonably expects to pay for a position upon hire, estimated in good faith. So important words that I think need to be highlighted in that aspect are obviously what's currently sort of what it currently pays for, but the words reasonably become really important, and good faith become incredibly important. So when we sort of have a debate on this later, as a drafting team, we sort of went back and forth on this. Do you sort of go with the US approach, which is so some of the words that we extracted from that from their laws are good faith and reasonably, or do you try to almost like put in range limits, so to say it must be within 10% or it must be within 20%, or I'll use a more practical example for you to sort of understand how this could be exploited. For all intents and purposes, if I was hiring, I could put out a job to say, I am looking for a parliamentary researcher. And then I could say, this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for someone who has either an honors or a master's degree in the areas of law or any social science. And they must have 1-2 years experience and must be available to work remotely and in Cape Town. And I put that out there, and in the salary sort of column, I say, well, I am going to pay between 20,000 Rand and 120,000 Rand per month, or rather between 500,000 and 1.5 million a year. Now, that is bizarre. Because that is a range that is clearly being left open for people to make a decision that's either 500 and 1,000 Rand or 1,490,000 Rand per annum, which is just, it's nonsensical, but it's an easy way for people to try to sort of get around this range, where I can just put the range so incredibly wide that there's just then no form of accountability, but I have ticked the box, but it actually doesn't penetrate the heart of what this bill is aiming to do, which is to promote pay transparency. And that's why even the heading is titled that way, that if you're going to put the range so wide that actually no one really knows what that job is worth, then are you actually promoting the spirit and the purport of the act, which is of the bill, which is to promote pay transparency? And the answer is clearly not. And so those are some of the dynamics that the drafting team had in front of it. And so specifically made an intentional decision to add a definition of what remuneration means, but have at this stage elected to go with a sort of good faith approach, asking people to put it as what it reasonably expects to pay for the position. And then obviously another really much more sort of concise barometer is what the employer currently pays for that position. So that is a little note on the discussion on what a remuneration range is, why it's specifically defined over here, and what is the mischief that we're trying to solve for in adding a definition over there, as to not to lead to the exploitment of that particular exploitation, I think, of that particular section. So then we can, I think, move on a little bit to section 6B, which speaks to the prohibition of using past or current remuneration information. I think this is also something through the testimonials of the speakers before me that I think a lot of people can really relate to, about at some sort of stage of your interview process or your appointment process being asked, so can we have your payslip? And, you know, for some people it is, I think that comes with various dynamics depending on where you are on your journey and what your experience of fair pay has been. But essentially, just to take us through the mechanisms of the prohibition section of this bill, section 6B1 says that past remuneration shall not justify any income differential or unfair discrimination. Then part 2 says, in the process of, once again, very much described process of recruitment, selection, or appointment of an employer is prohibited from inquiring into the past or current remuneration of an employee, or to require past or current remuneration information. I will come back to that specific definition on remuneration information. B, determining an employee's remuneration or terms and conditions of employment based on their past or current remuneration, unless an offer of employment has already been made to the applicant and the applicant makes a request in writing that their past or current remuneration be considered. And then that should be C. The employer may, without inquiring into past or current remuneration, discuss the employee's remuneration expectations within a remuneration range disclosed in terms of section 6A1B or C. So in simple terms, I think, again, just sort of touching on some of those lived experience discussions that we had, is, again, the mischief that this is trying to solve for is, if I have been working, for example, in the Eastern Cape, and I've been working as an accountant, and I've accumulated a specific amount of experience in the industry. I have the right qualifications and the years of experience. I might have also picked up a number of courses along the way, and I am now sort of moving to Johannesburg or Cape Town, and I am applying for a job, and I meet the requirements of the job. They are already, obviously, there's already a pay sort of scale that has been set up by what other employees possibly doing the same job that I'm going to be doing, that's already in place. But because I lived in a small town before, and my pay was 30 to 40% less than what my counterparts in Johannesburg are being paid, then my pay slip is used as a barometer to determine what my next pay is. That is what we talk about, sort of pay slips being an enabler of keeping you sort of entrapped and not necessarily being reflective of equal pay for equal work, essentially. So that is the prohibition on using past or current remuneration information. There are a couple of components I would like us to hone in on at this stage. So let's first look at 2.1a. And look at specific words. So that is inquiring into the past or current remuneration. So past or current are two important terms because it's not just about the pay slip that I'm using, or it's not just about the pay slip from the job that I'm currently in. So if I have had 4 jobs, and I'm currently in job number 4 and I'm about to move into job number 5, this bill doesn't just cover the pay slip of job number 4, it also protects with regards to all of pay slip number 3, number 2, and number 1. So just that you're aware of sort of the definitions of and the distinction of past or current remuneration, and that it is all encompassing. And then I think it's also important for us to go into some of the definitions on remuneration information. So remuneration information in the definition section means any information or records relating to or showing a person's remuneration, including salary records or proof of payment of remuneration. So again, an intentional definition, just to sort of deal with how this looks like in practice, because it might not always be like a traditional pay slip. It might be in the form of, for example, a proof of payment. So that is just to make sure that we're encapsulating anything that can be interpreted or anything that contains your past remuneration information, just so that is also clear as to why that particular term was used. And then I think it's also important that we speak about the who. So it's not just about the information being contained or presented by you as the individual who is job seeking, but it's also about other information holders. So for example, if I am trying to get a job and I am using a recruitment agency for all intents and purposes, it also means that that recruitment agency cannot use the information that I give them to give to an employee. So it also sort of tries to make sure that there's no sort of backdoor information getting through other potential people in this process that may hold your information. So if you gave your pay slip to the recruitment officer or a recruitment agency rather, in order for them to sort of scope out what kind of roles you're looking for and pay and all of those dynamics, then they too are also prohibited from sharing that information on, quote unquote, on your behalf to, or rather to the prospective employer. Okay, let's look into B next, determining an employee's remuneration or terms and conditions of employment based on their past or current remuneration, unless an offer of employment has already been made to the applicant and the applicant makes a request in writing that their past or current remuneration be considered. So there's 2 distinct steps over there which need to be met. The first is there's already an offer on the employment offer has already been made to the applicant. So there's already an offer on the table. We want to give you this job, and this is how we would like to give the job to you. And these are the terms and conditions, and this is the pay. And in addition to that, I, as the applicant, make a request in writing that my past or current remuneration be considered. So what this does is it flips the power dynamic in sort of these engagements, that if I'm in a position where I actually want to use my past or current remuneration or pay slip or pay remuneration information in the negotiation process post an offer being made, then it is my choice and my right to do so. And it obviously then expresses a mechanism by which I do that, and that is to make that request in writing. So that is important to also, it's a nuance that isn't always I think discussed, especially like by media or in headlines. It's easy just to say it puts a total ban. And I can see why in certain situations that could also be even alarming to a job seeker to say, well, actually, no, in the process of me applying or this promotion or wherever you sort of find yourself on the spectrum, you might actually want to be able to use that information for various reasons. And now you're probably thinking, oh, this strips away my ability to do so. And in fact, it disempowers me. But that's not the case at all. What it does is it tries to empower you in the right context where there is less room for sort of exploitative practices to happen to you in that context. So I'm sure if you sort of have followed this in the headlines, you're not necessarily going to see that particular nuance discussed, but it is important that it is there so that employees are also, and job seekers are also aware that this doesn't sort of strip their power in that way. And then lastly, the employer may, without inquiring into past or current remuneration, discuss the employee's remuneration expectations within a remuneration range disclosed in sections 6A, 1B or C. And that takes us back to sort of the connection between this prohibition and the promotion of fair pay, transparency, and how those two aspects actually work together, which is important. I think something that this bill does really well is it achieves sort of two components of prohibiting bad behaviors, but also promoting transparency, which then speaks to sort of that justice aspect and how this can actually be a really important tool in the project sort of justice and the economy. So that is a very sort of high level overview of what the bill does in terms of sort of its sections and subsections, just to give everyone, I think, a base level understanding of what it does. I'm sure, again, based on the sectors you represent, there are probably little, very technical niches that you have questions around, which I probably have not addressed in any detail at all. But that is what the engagement session will be between myself, Nikki, and Nadine. We will then be able to address and sort of start to do deep dives into some of maybe the key sectoral questions around the different components of the bill. I have said a lot. I hope it was relatively easy to follow with the text and some of sort of the explanations. And I'm not sure where we are in terms of time and the program. So I'll hand that back to Nanda in terms of when we then get into sort of a Q&A session. But thank you everyone for your time and attention on this.
Wow, that was an empowering session. Thank you so much to both of you ladies. Do you know what I realized? I enjoyed a lot of clarifications. Coming into today, I did have questions of my own, also because we are very active on social media. So you take in information and then afterwards, you're not sure if this is information or misinformation. One of the things that I do enjoy is that you said it's not a new act. For me, that's important because what I found in South Africa, sometimes when you're tackling issues, if you touch too much, if you change too much at the same time, it becomes catastrophic. So I enjoy that it's not a new act. That is powerful, that it is specific in an amending. We are amending an existing act, the Employment Equity Act, which is spoken about very beautifully, you know, in the broader sense of it. That mattered to me hearing that today. And I feel like I can respond with knowledge on social media when people are saying what is not true about the Fair Pay Bill. I also enjoyed Moses. It's a sentence she said in passing, wasn't really a main point, but she said the answer to unemployment cannot be exploitation. Right? I enjoy that so much, that we're not going to weaponize people's desperation now. Yeah, that was, for me, it was very important to hear. But before we do tea and all of that, I would like to hear, I mean, so far, so good, or so far, from what we've heard this morning, it's just meaty. We heard, you know, personal stories, and now we know the personal is political, but we've had so many people come up on the mic. I do want to take questions from the floor at this point, because we are all here and there's opportunity to get answers from some of our panelists who are in the room and online. I know online we've got Mr. Matthew Parks from COSATU in the room. We've got Robin Pasensis here with her expertise and business. We've got a lot of people who have the knowledge, and obviously our legal experts as well. And yeah, this is now, I don't know if you've ever watched Parliament Channel and they speak into the mics. This is now the speaking to the mic thing, where the mic is not going to roam around, but the mic is there where you are. Amanda, is that time. And on your desk, there's a button there for you to switch on the mic and ask a question. And the people in the room, I see a hand up there. We can take your question, and please, if this speaks to your sector and your expertise, then you can answer, but you can unmute yourself, ma'am.
Thank you, Nande. Just a quick question. Is it possible to get a copy of the actual bill? I mean, Ms. Rakavani did a wonderful job taking us through it, but it'd be wonderful actually as a lawyer to see it and go through detail, because I mean, I want to be able to look at the preamble and all of that as well. And then secondly, I just wanted to inquire as to what the actual current status of the bill is, because I can see from the Hansard that on the 18th of September, Honorable Glazel Webster already mentioned that she tabled it. Mudzuli as well mentioned that it was, the first version was submitted to Parliament on the 16th of June. But in searching for a copy of the bill, I've been unable to find it in either the draft or tabled bills, even when searching for the Employment Equity Act Amendment Bill. So if I could just have what the status is, and can we get a copy, please?
Yes, very good question. I know that the copies will be available. And a little side note is that on the program, we do have a parliamentarian here, Daksha, who will speak to the way forward, where we are. She'll speak to status, she'll speak to way forward and participation, but I will allow a commentary maybe from your side, just in short, to address her concern.
So in respect of the status of the bill, it's still in the drafting stage. So the correct term to then probably use is to refer to the bill as a draft bill. It's not been tabled yet in Parliament. It's not been introduced as yet. It's still sort of being formulated. And I think this engagement will also feed into what the content of the bill may look like.
Fantastic. I acknowledge your hand here in front, ma'am. You can go.
Good morning, everyone. As an HR professional with over 20 years experience, this is such an exciting space to be in, I must say. The question I have is, are we still able to provide inputs? My thoughts are specifically around the range, the salary range definition. Is that still going to be allowed at some point?
Yes, this is where I enjoyed the analogy we were using. I saw a few people use it of the baby. That Patrickolo birth. This is now the time where we put the nappies on the baby and we feed the baby so that the baby can move from draft to actual law. But this is a time opportunity for us to provide submissions, and maybe we'll talk to the process in how we submit those if someone can and clarify on that. But this is the time for us to make it better.
Perfect.
That's the aim.
Thank you.
Their hands online. Okay, great. Question online, we take it.
Hi, Nande. Maybe I can just quickly jump in here with regards to the previous question. It would be great because of the fact that some of the drafting team is here. At least we had envisaged just even being able to get your preliminary thoughts on like your particular issue that you raised was around remuneration range. And again, because you are someone who has very in-depth experience as an HR practitioner, it would be really helpful for us to hear your thinking. Also, if there's maybe further questions we have for you, this is definitely the platform for that. So yeah, if we can sort of just have an opportunity to hear thoughts as they are now, even outside then of the formal submission processes as they come then, because there might be an opinion that comes from an HR practitioner, which might be completely different from the opinion of a lawyer. And the reason why we would like all of those contexts to be spoken about in the room is so that we can see where there might be clashes or where there is synergy on that. So please feel free to express the view even at this stage outside of a sort of formal written response. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. So my thinking was the salary range, like the speaker mentioned, if it's too wide, it will just be seen as a tick boxing exercise. And actually putting it in the same clause that the salary must actually be disclosed, the current salary for the person, the incumbent that's in the role or about to leave the role must be disclosed, because that limits the ability to make that range so wide so that it becomes a tick boxing exercise. And the reason why that is so good, or why it would be good, is like I said, the actual rate paid makes equity audits enforceable, number one. It directly supports the legislative purpose of the Fair Pay Bill or the draft bill. The approach, we have already been told that it's consistent with global best practice. It also protects employees under the EEA Section 6A and Section 6B that we've seen. And yeah, generally it helps with transparency. And it prevents that tick boxing exercise that we often see when legislation is vague or too broad and too open.
Absolutely. Can we hear from the online team? Henry, I see your hand is up. You've got the mic.
Thank you very much. My name is Henry. I just want to speak as an employee or a job seeker. Victimization sometimes becomes an issue. For instance, the fact that we are not allowed to share our pay slips at the workplace or discuss salaries at the workplace. Is there any measures in place, perhaps, that guide us as to how can we be protected in the workplace so that we're not victimized by our employers or prospective employers? Is there any tool, perhaps, that this bill takes into account to protect the employees? Hope that helps. Thanks.
Is there? You raised a fair point.
Yeah. Thanks, Nande. Maybe I can speak or to the first part, particularly from the speaker just before Henry. I had a follow-up question for her, if that's okay. So do you envisage basically at a practical level, if you were releasing an advert, that it's almost like two separate compulsory steps for the salary range. So an advert would have to have, if there is an existing position like that, so if you are hiring another senior accountant and you already have 10 other senior accountants, that, or another senior accountant, that you would put what you currently pay that role. And in addition to that, what you are then expecting to pay the new entrant. So either that specific amount or a range of that entrant. So do you see it as it's two exercises? So you can't just, even if your range is fair, so even if you put a reasonable and good faith range of between 1 million and 1.2 million, that's not good enough. It has to be what you're currently paying the incumbent, if that exists, and in addition to the range. So I just want to be clear that you don't see it as necessarily one or the other. You see it as working together to promote it's almost like an additional level of transparency if it is an obligation to disclose two of those things and not just one or the other, just for clarity. And then once you answer, I believe then Nadine is going to hop on and just speak to what Henry was discussing, which is around what are the consequences or current measures of protection around sort of retaliatory practices around then sharing salaries in the workplace. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, I definitely see it as two separate actions. And the reason for that is you will have cases where it's a completely new position. So there's no one in the position. So there's no historic data, no historic information. It could be a brand new position, which is not always that prevalent. Most positions have been around, or similar positions have been around. So yes, to answer your question, I do see it as two separate actions, but it speaks to each other and it supports each other. The other thing that businesses often do, there's a percentile range. So often a business will say, we will pay incumbents between this range, and it's based on a percentile. So they will say, we pride ourselves in paying anyone entering into this business at least on the 25th percentile. Or they'll say, we will start you on the 50th percentile. And that's where we speak about the range. So if the range, for example, is 100,000 to 150,000, your 25th percentile would be at the entry level, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's why I think it is important that that range is not abused, for lack of a better word. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
Is Nadine online?
Yes, Nadine's online.
Ah, so good to hear your voice, Nadine. There you are. There she is.
Hi. Yes, just to answer the question about victimization, I think it's a very important question in the context of any kind of discrimination issue, because often that is how it practically manifests in the context of a discrimination case, is that it's at the point of someone trying to exercise their rights under the Act that they are then discriminated against or victimized. And that is the good news is that it's already addressed in the Employment Equity Act. I was trying to just find the section, but there is currently already, so this is where it's important that it's an amendment act and not a new dispute. So some of the issues, and it's quite an important thing for people looking at the bill to remember, the draft bill, to remember to read it in the context of the existing act, so that you can see how it fits into other protections and other procedures. And if there are questions about that, we can look at those. But you'll see, I think it's in section 51 of the existing act that says, no one, where it's about protection of employees' rights in Part C of the Act, where section 51(2) reads, first 51(1) is no person may discriminate against an employee who exercises any right conferred by this Act. So that would then include the new provisions of the amendment bill. And without limiting the general protection of this subsection, no person may threaten to do or do any of the following: And then it lists in paragraph A and B, prevent someone from exercising a right or from participating in proceedings, prejudice an employee because of past, present, or anticipated exercise of the right, including B1 specifically, I think that goes to the question, I think it was Henry who asked it, no one may threaten or actually prejudice an employee because past, present, or anticipated disclosure of information that the employee is lawfully entitled or required to give to another person. So simple terms, if you're asked to exercise, if you're asked to provide information to someone else or share that information, this section would protect you in that moment. So I hope that answers the question.
It's a question. Okay, thank you. So my question as a student and a young professional, I would like to ask, how does the bill actually monitor and enforce compliance in less informalized sectors? I'm speaking on behalf of our mothers back home because we are from less privileged background. So that is my main question. As Honorable Musi Maiman, I've spoken that we are breaking those multi-dimensionality of poverty. So that is my question.
I am enjoying that question. She's speaking from a student's perspective. Is there support? And I'm also asking for small businesses. Is there support for small business on how to transition and change in this aspect? I know big corporates often say, oh, you're taking the power. And we've cleared that out today, that no power is taken from you, but these are the guidelines. But is there support for small business? And as she articulated beautifully, for students and all of that? Are you answering? I see your hand is up.
I was asked to answer that question again. So I think that it's an excellent question and one that we should ask in relation to all the protections that this bill is aimed at trying to give citizens. And the answer is, again, as it was with the previous provision, that, well, let me answer it in two ways. The first is that it will apply to informal employers or smaller employees in the informal sector. And then I'm going to come back to the question. Let me just say one more thing about this. Then I'll come back to the question for how employees in the informal sector can access these provisions. So again, the first point is that all employers, regardless of size, will be required, whether you are applying. Sorry, let me finish the first part of my sentence. Will be required to not rely on past salary information. So that was the that part of the bill that Mzuli had referred to. And you'll see that the Act applies to all employers, and not simply to designated employers, as is the case of the provisions of the second part of the Act that deals with affirmative action, for example. So all employers are bound. There is a slight difference in the sense that we deal, for example, with, it's not a difference in how in whether it applies, a difference in how it applies. I think you'll see that there are requirements, for example, to do to disclose the ranges when you are doing the what's it called, salary, job grading and job classification. Now we know that somebody who is employing a domestic worker at home is not going to be doing job grading and evaluation in any kind of formal sense. But the Act still operates on the basis that if, for example, if you advertise, yes, you must disclose the salary. But also if you are going to someone, if someone comes to your home and says, I'm looking for a job, and how much would you pay? You are required to disclose that upfront. And that's actually very empowering, I think, for people who are in a more informal section or sector. So there's no extra kind of admin that is required from an employer in the informal sector, in the sense that there's no further information that you need to publish. You don't have to advertise, for example, because not everybody advertises jobs in the informal sector. But if you are considering employing someone in that sector, you must say to them, that's how the Act would apply, that you must say to them, this is how much I will pay, or this is how much I anticipated to pay. Otherwise, as we all know, anybody who's been in the informal sector, or a young entrant's the right word, into the sector, you don't always know how much it should be paying. And so that lack of kind of empowerment in that moment, and that kind of position of less, having less information than the person you are speaking to, means that people, particularly those who are desperate for work, will be willing to take anything, very little kind of pay. And so this enables people, even in the informal sector, to have that protection. In terms of how, as an employee in the informal sector, you can exercise the right, that right, I think it's very important to understand that this is a problem generally with the Employment Equity Act and a lot of other legislation, is we would need to make sure by we I mean all of us, whether we are lawyers or parliamentarians or people in business or people in civil society, we do have to make sure that people know about this right. There are particular things that in this bill that provides that if you ask for something, so if you ask for any pay range, even the one that you're currently employed in, the employer must provide that. And secondly, for example, you can ask for your salary to be considered when you feel like that will actually help you in the negotiation. So if you've already had this struggle in the past, or if you've already done quite well and been given an employment opportunity, especially for people who would classically be kind of vulnerable in the sense that they are not paid as much as a white man, for example. So a Black woman might feel like, I've already had this struggle in my previous position. I want you to see that a previous employer had actually paid me more than you might think that you should pay me. Then you can ask for that again once you've been made an offer. But for these provisions to work in practice will depend on people actually needing to know that they have these rights under the proposed legislation. I hope that answers your question about the informal sector.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nadine. You mentioned something so important for me, which I don't know if I knew that or not, but I'm hearing you say that the bill is revolutionary, not just for those entering the job market. Like in my existing position, we can make corrective measures, we can request. That's powerful to know, and thank you for that clarification. There's a question from Felicia online, and then I'll move over to the floor to everyone else. We've got time.
Good day, everyone. I hope everyone is good. So I just wanted to ask, since South Africa sees an influx and oversaturation of foreigners in the job market, so I was just wondering if the Fair Pay Bill would have an impact in addressing this issue. Thank you so much.
Nande, I can take that. Yes, okay. So I think something that was important that I did address earlier, and I think Nobuntu might have also mentioned this as well, is labor is very broad. There's lots of legislation, lots of regulations, lots of various issues. I mean, there are certain stakeholders in the room today who have done incredible work on other issues in labor as it pertains to just disclosures of CEOs and how much money they make, and lowest earner and highest earner. Like, the issues are broad. And it is an easy temptation for even this forum to get into every labor issue and sundry and try to squeeze it into this particular bill. And that is not the intention. So you will note that the focus and the scope of this bill is incredibly limited. And that is an intentional decision, one, on the particular mischief we're trying to solve, but also two, with regards to even the processing and the passing of the bill itself. Once you convolute an amendment bill in particular with issues that are incredibly broad, you make it difficult for the processing and the passing of that, the eventual passing of that bill. So from a drafting perspective and from a cause perspective, this is incredibly focused and nuanced to deal with this particular issue as it pertains to unfair pay practices. And it's also in regards to solving those two particular issues of transparency and previous pay issues. So that is a long way of saying no, that does not solve for sort of the broader immigration labor crisis that South Africa is currently facing. That is not the intention of the bill, nor will it be in the scope of this particular bill, because there's a strategic decision, but also just a focus on what can be solved in this, what can be solved with some measure of ease, even though there's even difficulties in just adding like those 6 lines into this amendment bill. So yes, I hope that gives you clarity on the focus and what it won't, the impact that it won't have on ancillary labor issues that the country faces at the moment. Thanks.
I'll take the question on my right and then we'll move to you. And a few have been texted online. So loving the conversation. Go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. So I just have one concern regarding the draft bill. So obviously the bill or draft bill aims for fairness and transparency, but at the same time, we need to consider nepotism and smuggling within the workplace. So I want to know, as an outsider and as the people, are there any procedures or anything put in place to prevent that from happening?
Nepotism.
Yeah, I think that's a really good. Sorry, Nande, through you, I just jumped in on that. I do think that is a really good question to ask, and I think again, anyone who has worked in sort of any environments, not just sort of big corporate environments, but generally in the workplace, you do see sort of nepotism sort of showing its face when it comes to particularly pay. So again, what this bill isn't intended to solve for is people squeezing, their cousin into the workforce, because that's not what the bill is particularly trying to address. But what it can in some ways address, the issue that you're raising, is, well, now the CEO's cousin is coming in to the space and they are doing the same work, if not less than me, but they're getting paid more than me. That's the level in sort of the nepotism ecosystem that this bill can solve for. So it's not going to keep someone out. That's not the scope of the bill. But what it does do is that it protects the rest of sort of the people who came in on sort of their own merit, who are working hard, from being paid unfairly with regards to people who are just connected. And I think part of the conversations that we've also had, even in the drafting process, is looking at, the public sector is an environment where so much of pay transparency is actually done better than what it is in corporate. And then so even though there's lots of issues in sort of public administration and there, at the very least, at least the consequences of sort of cronyism and those issues that we see politically, there is even measures at that stage to protect at that level. So can we keep the nepos out? No. But is there some level of, I guess, pay protection for yourself entering the job market or promotions, wherever you find yourself in the spectrum, as it pertains to pay? Yes.
So if I could just come in there just to add, if I may, I think that what's important is that it definitely will create a more open environment. And often the difficulty with, I think nepotism is allowed to happen because it was enabled in a sense when there is more secrecy. And I think one of the ways in which the bill operates, or the draft bill operates, in two ways. The one is to kind of force a more rational approach to salaries and remuneration generally, in the sense that you must not just consider the person, you must consider the job first before you consider the person. And so in other words, the value of the job, which by the way is an existing value. The HR professionals here will know that's an existing approach to good HR practice, but it is also currently already required in the, there was reference to the ILO convention, but also in the existing code of good practice and in the regulations. So it's already required that employers approach it in that way. But this draft bill certainly cements that. And the second is then that you not only have to be more rational, in other words, that would notionally exclude the idea of nepotism, but also you will be required to reveal that. So both at the level of someone applying for a job, if the CEO's cousin is up for consideration, then it must be disclosed to everyone. And it's actually quite a good way to remove situations like that, because you will know beforehand, before the CEO's nephew is being considered, the company must disclose how much they will pay. And the second then is if you are, even if you're not applying for the job, if you are in the job at the moment in that category, or doing also like the CEO's nephew, doing something in that same position, then you can also ask for the disclosure of your the salary band in which you are employed. So importantly, perhaps also in relation to the previous question about foreigners, it's important that this draft bill doesn't try and amend the definition of employee or employer, except in one respect, which is that, and it's not a new thing in the Act, it's just that there's already provision in the Act for which sections the protections of the EEA would extend to applicants. And in this case of this draft bill, it also just makes clear that these sections, 6A and 6B, would also be covered by that. So in relation to who's covered, whether it addresses your nationality or whatever, this amendment bill is actually on top of the existing Employment Equity Act definitions of employers and employees. So it doesn't seek to address or expand those or limit, for that matter, any other definitions of employer or employee.
Before we move on to the next question, Robin, you wanted to provide clarity in this vein as well.
Yes, so just by way of introduction, my name is Robin Pesenti. I'm with the organization Undoing Tax Abuse. I must make a very big disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. So I'm not going to provide any comments that are going to provide you any legal clarity. So don't hold anything against me. And I think most importantly, as a woman of color, as most of us here today, we have had sort of a hellfire of a baptism in this world about what it means to operate. We know what marginalization feels like. And to the questions about the informal sector and particularly nepotism, I think what we should keep in mind is that this particular draft bill, what it seeks to amend is that it's trying to legislate a spirit of transparency and open access to information, but it operates in a social and political context that has entrenched certain behaviors, actions, and beliefs. And if we actually want the spirit of what this amendment bill is trying to capture, to speak to women, I think particularly in the informal sector, trying to curb corrupt behaviors, is that we need to participate in that. So I think that beyond the specific legalities of what the bill is trying to propose, I think that is the work that we are actually trying to do. So we all know, for example, that assault is a crime. You shouldn't do it. But people do it every single day. And we also know that there are people who are aware of said perpetrators,
but we don't say anything. And this is the same for what's happening here. So if you know that there's a push for nepotism or corrupt hiring practices within your organization, you should look at the bill as a tool to help you leverage your voice and your power. But it was said earlier as well that this is not a catch-all. It cannot be a silver bullet, and it also operates within a larger legislative framework. So, for example, this is an amendment to the Employment Equity Act, but we also have other labor and employment acts. For example, we had the Second Companies Amendment Act that came into force last year that also seeks to talk about the divide between remuneration of the top level people and what they earn and the lowest earning employee. So we should also be talking about it within that ecosystem. But I think to answer your question is that it's collective and civil action that I think is going to make this bill, hopefully if it becomes law and it amends the Employment Equity Act, actually work for communities.
Fantastic. The gentleman in the front.
Hi there. My question was just on transparency is obviously a key aim to reduce pay inequalities. And my question is, how does this bill propose to monitor or enforce compliance with the salary range disclosure requirements? Will there be, for example, sanctions or incentives that would be implemented? Thank you.
Who would like to take that one?
Sorry, I was just going to ask Nande, I'm not sure if you are aware, there was a question posted on the chat. So we just had a caucus that Nadine would just be able to please respond to Micah on the chat, and then also tackle then the question on around compliance and consequences of lack of compliance around pay transparency in the bill. Thanks, Nande.
And I think the answer is again, it's a very good answer. And I think from our point of view is on the technical side of things, we do want to make sure that whatever we are proposing here, or whatever BOSA proposes in this bill, that it is enforceable. So please apply your minds also to whether we are correct in what I'm going to answer. And my answer is that as I understand that is currently dealt with in the EEA. Again, with the usual procedures. So yes, I want to make a point also that first, as a starting point, that also applies to the question that was posed on the chat group. And that is that it's important to remember that there are two parts of the EEA. The one deals with unfair discrimination. So it operates on the level of individual rights. Or groups of people enforcing their right not to be discriminated against. And then on the other hand, there's the provisions that deal with affirmative action. So if the question is, how do we make sure that to the extent that this impacts on the affirmative action questions, that they are properly enforced? The answer to that will be in the part of the act that deals with the remedies in that situation. And you may or may not know that relates to a complaint in the second part of the act. If you are concerned about whether an employer is complying with the employment equity requirements in the act, that must be done through the Department of Labor and investigations by inspectors and so on. But the way I see it is that there's actually very little that impacts on that part of the existing act, other than I think to strengthen the provisions regarding pay differentiation. It strengthens it in one respect only, as I see the bill, and that is that it impacts on if somebody is unsure about the current sort of levels of pay in their area, their part of a business, then they can ask for that in order to find out what is going on in their particular kind of level of employment. And that's important, I think, because in the way that the Employment Equity Act is drafted in the moment, and particularly in relation to those forms that are attached to the Act, which you have to submit in order to indicate to the department what the different pay on different levels would be. You don't always know exactly where you fit into that, and the categories can be quite broad. So I think that's as far as I can see, and maybe I'm wrong. You can please ask a follow-up if I didn't quite understand the focus of that question. But when it comes to unfair discrimination, the enforcement of that won't be through that part. It won't be through the submission of forms and the kind of testing the employer's compliance with their own targets and so on. I think where that will be where the protection of that lies is in the exercise of your individual rights. So you are likely to see either kind of grievances in the workplace based on a discrimination complaint, depending on the internal provisions of a code of conduct and company's own grievance procedures, and or a kind of litigation or approaching the CCMA under the provisions regarding how to enforce your unfair discrimination right, or your right not to be subjected to unfair discrimination. I hope that answers the question. I think there's the question, just want to look again what the question was on the chat group, but I think it has a similar slant in the sense that it deals with the good governance and due diligence safeguards in relation, if I understand the question correctly. This is, by the way, whose question is that? It's Micah's question. So I think, yes, when it comes to something like fronting and window dressing for purposes of the BBBEE Act, and again, that, as I see it, relates to affirmative action measures. In other words, how you are employing people from designated groups at every level of employment. There again, I think this Act, even though it creates a better culture of transparency and hopefully encourages, particularly on the issue of pay equality, it encourages a better conversation in the workplace about that. It does not in itself address issues of fronting or, and for that matter, any other aspect of the BBBEE Act or its codes or its regulations and so on. But again, what it does do is it will require that at every level of employment, there's a thoughtful engagement with the question, not just whether you are employing people from designated groups, but how you are remunerating them and creating more openness around that. And you would have seen also in the bill that was circulated and that Muzuli was speaking to, so it was an update from the pre-parliamentary process draft bill. In that there's a specific provision also that says that whether you can never justify a pay inequality, whether for purposes of BBBE or for purposes of the affirmative action documentation that you are submitting to the Department of Labor, you can never justify a pay disparity simply because of past inequality. And you don't have to be a lawyer to see that immediately, that if you were allowed to do that, that would just lead to a kind of entrenchment and perpetuation of past discrimination. But in terms of your question, it doesn't actually deal with fronting and other sort of more contentious issues in the broad-based economic empowerment, Black economic empowerment context. I hope that answers both questions.
I want to check, there were questions that were sent on the chat. Lerato at the back, could you read those if they aren't addressed? And after you, I'll take this gentleman and a few other hands that, go ahead, Lerato. If you can read the questions that came through via chat.
Good afternoon, everybody. This question is from Mika Gengang, who represents the Ethos Verify Pty Limited, and she says it's a due diligence assurance business in the BEE sector. The question reads, given that the Fair Pay Bill aims to enhance fairness and accountability, has the committee considered whether the position of governance and due diligence safeguards should be formally incorporated into the application in order to strengthen transformation, integrity, and to reduce fronting and window dressing that the Triple BEE Act aims to
Oh, I get it.
address.
This is what Nadine was addressing right now. That's very good that we were able to capture that one as well. We will take the gentleman at the back.
Thank you very much. I am Kwanele Ngogela from Just. First of all, I would like to acknowledge Paybe Fairley for this wonderful bill and also commend BOSA for adopting it. Thank you very much for that. My brief contribution is not a question. One, I would say I wouldn't consider at this stage that we would want to add any inputs to the draft bill in and of itself, because on average, these amendments takes more or less around 4 to 5 years. So at this point in time, I would say when the green paper is actually published and we are invited for commentary by the National Assembly or INSOP, depending where it will go, we'll actually make our comments there. So editing at this point will prolong the process. Two, based on the work that we actually do, what we've gathered, studying and contributing to this bill from its inception, I think 3 years ago, the inherent risk relating to pay transparency is the issue of ranges that employees should publish. So we do agree that the salary range must be narrow, genuine, and job grade specific and reflect the actual pay that the employer intends to offer. Now, some of the modalities we won't be able to deal with in terms of addressing this problem here, but we know that should this bill pass and becomes law, it will trigger maybe also an amendment to regulation. That's when the rubber will actually hit the road. And maybe what I want to put on the table is that it is only that time when we actually say, what does it mean in terms of EEA4 reporting? As we know now, employers are required to submit these forms that are called income differential statements to the Department of Employment and Labor. So I think it will actually trigger amendments to the current regulations, as we know, also around 15 April this year, when the Employment Equity Amendment Act of 2022 came into law, it triggered regulations. So we know we currently have those regulations on sector numerical EE targets, and I also think this will also trigger that. So the conversations that we'll be having maybe after this is how do we envision how to reconfigure the EEA4 to address the issue of ranges. Thank you.
Yes, while we chew on that, it is true. I think the bill will introduce and trigger a whole lot of other transformational things. As we said, it's a journey and a tool within a bigger framework. And I don't know about you, but I think at this time I want to introduce a comfort break. Feel the body, hydrate, stretch your legs, outside, like move, step away from your seat. And also don't forget that you still have that access, that pathway for your voice to get to us via that QR code input, answer the questions there. And then when we come back from our break, our eating break, we'll hear procedurally from Parliament a clear explanation on how private members' bill moves through the process. Then we get that clarity, right? And after that, I will say back to you what has been said today. But I think right now,
it's time for us to move and refresh ourselves and come back with greater clarity.
And hence my presentation will largely cover the rules relating to private members' bills. I mean, I know most of you in the room here have probably engaged with bills that have been introduced by the executive. So this presentation will only focus on the rules dealing with the introduction of a private members' bill. I'm not sure if my PowerPoint is being displayed. I think it's about to show. So we can move on to the second slide. However, before I go into the rules that regulate the processing of a private member's bill, I thought I'd just touch on the regulatory framework that gives the authority to a private member to introduce the bill into Parliament. The first section I'd like to hone in on is section 43 and 44 of the Constitution, which vests the legislative authority in Parliament. And Parliament is then both the National Assembly as well as the National Council of Provinces. The Assembly then, in exercising its legislative power, has authority to initiate and prepare legislation. So often this is seen as committee bills, which are introduced by a committee itself, but it can also be through the private member, and I'll recording in progress a little bit later. The other section I'd like to elaborate on is section 73(2) of the Constitution, which specifically empowers a member of the Assembly to introduce a bill into the Assembly. So that same section also speaks about ministers and deputy ministers being able to introduce bills, committees being able to introduce bills, but also expressly mentions that a member may introduce a bill. Now, having said that, the National Assembly rules, which govern the processes in Parliament, in Rule 268 states that the Assembly initiates or prepares legislation in terms of the rules for introduction as envisaged in section 73(2) of the Constitution, also through its members. Hence, the NA rules too expressly provide for the authority of a private member's bill. Now, having said that, next slide, please. Having said that, we all know that before any bill is drafted in the department, and we heard a speaker earlier on mention the green paper, the department develops a policy through the green paper, white paper, calls for comment, and so forth. When it comes to a private member, a member doesn't have that capacity generally to develop a policy that then goes out for comment. But before any draft can be prepared, the member must know what he or she wants to achieve in his or her bill, because the policy will then outline the regulatory object. In other words, what is the aim of the proposed legislation? What should the bill achieve? It also then outlines the solutions proposed, and this includes reconsidering your solution. Is it the best mechanism to address the mischief that you wish to do? Or are there other ways in which one can do this? And then what the policy then also does, it identifies the mischief in law. In other words, where does the existing law fail? How should it be amended? Should there be other pieces of legislation that also need to be amended? Should this be an amendment bill? Should this be a standalone bill? And obviously in this instance, as we've heard the previous speakers speak to, this is an amendment of a principal act known as the Employment Equity Act. This then will be known as the Employment Equity Amendment Bill, because it will amend the principal act. So when it comes to a private member's bill, like I said, there is no green paper. The member, together with the party members, together with input from US stakeholders, will develop the policy, and that policy intent then will translate into the content of the bill. Now, once the policy is developed, Rule 272 of the National Assembly rules deals with how the process is kick-started. So these are your pre-introduction steps that a member must take. Rule 272 provides that a member who intends to initiate or prepare legislation in an individual capacity for introduction must prepare a draft bill. The draft bill must also have a supporting memorandum setting out the objects of the bill in the form and style that complies with any prescribed requirements. Now, normally, our office, once the policy is developed by the member, our office then assists the member in the drafting of the bill. But as we've heard from previous speakers, Honorable Webster has already had a drafting team on board that has prepared drafts of the bill, which has been then submitted to my office. And we then check the bill to see that it's drafted in terms of drafting conventions, and as well to ensure from the very beginning whether the bill is constitutional. During the development of the bill, further research and policy development can occur because drafting a bill is not a thumbs up. There's a lot of research, stakeholder engagement, comments that need to be taken on board, and inputs that need to be considered. It's not something that can be done overnight. I have my colleague here nodding his head. I assume you come from a department where sometimes departments take at least 5 years with the policy development as well as drafting a draft bill before it comes to Parliament. Now, I understand that there was a question that was posed to the member and to BOSA as to how will this engagement input into the drafting. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this bill is still a draft bill. It's still in the process of being formulated. So I understand from the honourable member that any input taken from here will be fed to her legal team for consideration. Any proposals made will be considered, and those that the member agrees to will then be put into the content of the bill. The next step then is the member must then publish his or her notice of intention to introduce the bill, together with an explanatory summary of the bill, or if the draft bill is already finalized, publish the draft bill as it is to be introduced in the Government Gazette. Now, normally our officers advise the member to first publish the explanatory summary, which will then also summarize the proposed content of the bill, and together with that publication, call for comment from the public for input into the proposed content of the bill. And we normally advise the member in this way so that it gives the member the opportunity to consider those comments, and those comments then can find its way into the draft bill before it is introduced. Now, if the draft bill itself is introduced by the member, any comments that then come as a result of that process will feed into the committee process. The member isn't then given an opportunity to amend the bill, because the bill that gets published must be the bill as it is to be introduced. Moving on. Now we get to the actual introduction of the bill. So the notice of intention has been published. The call for comment has been published. The member has now finalized the version of the bill that he or she intends to introduce. Rule 279 then says, for a member to introduce the bill, the member must submit to the Speaker a copy of the bill, or if the bill as it was to be introduced was published, a copy of that gazette. If the bill was not published, then a copy of the explanatory summary in the Government Gazette that it featured, as well as a supporting memorandum, which we often refer to as the memorandum on the objects of the bill, which is always attached at the end of the bill. That memo must state whether the bill is proposed to be introduced as a Section 75 bill or a 76 bill, because that then determines the parliamentary process that that particular bill will undergo. Now, Section 75 bills are bills in the Constitution are referred to as bills that do not affect provinces. So there isn't really provincial consultations held on the bill. And then Section 76 bills are your bills that affect provinces, where they would then, when it's then referred to the NCOP, there's a whole 6-week cycle where the provincial consultations must be held, and then mandates will come to the parliamentary committee for consideration towards finalizing a bill. For all intents and purposes, the content of this particular fair play draft bill that's on the table, it looks as if it would be a Section 75 bill. A determination on whether it's a 75 bill or 76 bill can only really be made once the bill is completely finalized, because every provision must then be looked at. The supporting memorandum must also then explain the objects of the bill. It must also give an account on whether there will be any financial implications for the state, as well as personnel implications, because ultimately they would then be the implementers of the bill. I mean, they might even have to monitor compliance with the bill. It wouldn't be the member that does that. The member must also then, in this memo, list the consultations that she has held, the stakeholders she consulted with into the development of the bill. And then also attached to this would be an opinion on the actual classification of the bill, which is whether the member thinks it should be a 75 or 76 bill. But again, this is a proposed classification. Moving on, when the bill is introduced, our office is obligated, or not obligated, we need to provide a certification of the bill. So in terms of Rule 279, we need to certify the bill to say whether the bill is consistent with the Constitution and existing legislation, and also that the bill is properly drafted in the form and style which conforms to legislative drafting practices. Now, it doesn't mean that if we don't certify the bill, so say if, for example, we find that there are constitutional challenges in the bill, it doesn't mean that the member can't introduce it, but we will need to obviously make the committee that deals with the bill aware of that constitutional challenge. The bill then that's introduced by the member must also contain on its cover page a reference to the name of the member, because that member would be the one sponsoring the bill through Parliament. When the bill is introduced, the proposed classification is also referred to the joint tagging mechanism, as they are the ones who take the ultimate decision on whether the bill should be a Section 75 bill or a 76 bill. Our office again assists the member in drafting this opinion or this proposal to the joint tagging mechanism, and they then take the decision based on the opinion that we furnish to them. The classification of the bill and all the findings must then be conveyed to the Portfolio Committee considering the bill, as well as tabled in the Assembly, because that then illustrates to everybody the process that this bill will undertake, meaning a Section 75 or 76. When the bill is then introduced, it's placed on the order paper for its first reading. This is now when the bill is formally before Parliament. The first reading really consists of an introduction by the member in charge, followed by the debate. But the debate is confined to the principles of the bill. It doesn't at this point deal with the actual content of the bill. The bill is tabled by the Speaker. The bill is placed on the order paper for the first reading. And when the bill is read a first time, the Speaker must refer the bill and all the annexures to the Portfolio Committee, under which the subject matter falls. This will go to the Portfolio Committee on Employment and Labour. And the Portfolio Committee must then deal with the bill in accordance with the National Assembly rule. What then happens in the committee in terms of the processes in a Rule 286 is that when the committee receives the bill, the committee must give the private member enough notice before that particular committee considers the bill. And the reason for that is that the private member will now be the one who comes to this committee to brief the committee on the contents of the bill, any submissions that the member may have received, and to also give the committee a an outline on what the policy intent was, what the mischief is that the bill intends to address. So the member then is invited to come and give a briefing to the committee. Where it is a private member's bill, the committee must also give the relevant department in the National Executive Authority sufficient opportunity to make submissions on the bill. Like I said earlier, they would be the enforcers, the implementers of the bill, so they need to come and also give their viewpoint on what they think of the content of the bill. Now, with the private members bill, after that briefing is held and there's been some informal discussion on the bill with the department as well, the committee must then consider a motion of desirability on the subject matter of the bill. So this is at this point, the committee will decide if the bill is desirable enough for the committee to continue processing the bill. If the committee feels that it's not, then the bill is rejected at that point and must immediately table the bill and its report in the assembly. However, if the motion of desirability is adopted, in other words, the committee is of the view that this particular piece of legislation is something that we should proceed with, it's desirable, it's what's needed, the committee will then process the bill and deliberate the bill as normal. Now, what I mean by as normal, there will be another invitation for public comments at this point. The committee may, after receiving those public comments, decide to hold oral hearings. They're not obliged to hold oral hearings. Following the oral hearings, the members will engage in deliberations. From the oral hearings, they may consider making amendments to the bill. They then formally consider the bill clause by clause and then adopt the bill and its report and then present this to the assembly. And the assembly will then put this on, schedule this for a second reading. Once the second reading is done and the National Assembly adopts the bill, it then goes to the second House of Parliament, which will be the National Council of Provinces, and they again will do another call for comment, deliberate on the bill. If it's a 75 bill, they can, through submissions received, propose amendments to the NA. At that point, the NA isn't obliged to take on those amendments, but they must consider them. Had it been a 76 bill, then the NA will need to consider any redraft that comes from the National Council of Provinces. Now, I also understand that stakeholders have been asking whether public submissions make any difference in the lawmaking process. Now, public participation is entrenched in the Constitution in both Section 59 as well as Section 72, as well as for the provincial legislatures, but I'm not going to touch on provincial legislatures at this point. So Section 59 and 72 both stipulate that the NA or NCOP must facilitate public involvement in legislative and other processes of the council and its committees. So the responsibility to facilitate public participation is a material part of the lawmaking process that's entrenched in our Constitution. Now, next slide, please. Now, in one of the leading Constitutional Court judgments, which I'm sure most of us have heard of, is the Doctors for Life case, where they looked at the duty to facilitate public participation by Parliament. And they said that the ordinary meaning of what public participation or public involvement, as it is referred to in the Constitution, means. They said it refers to the process by which the public participates in something. It's the facilitation of public involvement in the legislative process, therefore means taking steps to ensure that the public participates in the legislative process. Now, even though there's an obligation on Parliament to facilitate public involvement, or what we all commonly know as public participation, there is no provision that says how Parliament should do it. So Parliament has considerable discretion to determine how best to fulfill their duty to facilitate public involvement. A common practice has always been a call for written comments. Most committees then also do oral hearings, but that is at the discretion of the committee, depending on the nature of the submissions that have been received, the complexity of the bill, and or if they need further clarification from the stakeholders that have made those written submissions. So although the methods in adopting public involvement may vary from case to case, the courts have said that the legislature must act reasonably when facilitating public involvement. Oh, wow. Very important topic. The lights are going on. And there was light. So the courts have also said that in order to determine whether the legislature has acted reasonably in discharging its duty to facilitate public involvement will depend on a number of factors. Firstly, the nature and importance of the legislation and the intensity of its impact on the public. Now, we also as Parliament pass bills which are technical in nature. They correct errors. Now, a bill like that will not need an intensive public participation process. So in an instance like that, it would be enough for Parliament to merely call on written submissions, and that's where the public participation process can stop, because we've had situations that on bills like that, we don't even get one submission. So the nature and importance of the legislation and the intensity and impact on the public is important. The practicalities involved, such as time and expenses, which relate to the efficiency of the lawmaking process. But the courts have cautioned that saving of money and time in itself does not justify inadequate opportunities for public involvement. And then another factor that the courts will consider is what the legislature itself considered to be appropriate public involvement in light of the legislation's content, importance, and urgency. Now, most of us know we have had the Constitutional Court invalidate legislation where they found that the public participation process was inadequate, and then Parliament had to redo the whole process. We've often had the President send back legislation to Parliament where public participation processes were inadequate. What that Doctors for Life case also then said is that there are at least two aspects to the duty to facilitate public involvement. It must be an opportunity to provide meaningful opportunities. It's not just a tick box exercise. And then the duty to take measures to ensure that people have the ability to take advantages. So the type of public participation that is held must also be accessible to the public. Now, having said that, what is the main or general practice of public participation in relation to the legislative process? Often in Parliament, when the bill is introduced and it's in the committee, the bill will then be published for public comment. We often give about 30 days to allow for public comment. Once all the submissions are received, every single submission is summarized by committee support staff. And as legal advisors, we then identify the legal and constitutional concerns that are raised in the public submissions. The department's job, as well as the committee support's job, is also to then identify the policy issues that get raised in public submissions. But I can assure you every submission received is summarized, is analyzed, because we often get a thick matrix like that to go through. The summary then and the analysis is presented to the committee together with all the written submissions received. And this is often done by the content advisor, who then presents the summary. Like I said before, if the committee decides it's necessary to hold oral hearings, there will then be an opportunity for public hearings. When those public hearings are concluded, the department is called upon to respond to the public hearings, either by identifying themes or issues of policy, issues of constitutional concerns. Our office too then presents our own response to the constitutional concerns raised, as well as any legal issues that are raised. And we give our viewpoint on whether the constitutional concerns are legitimate or whether they can be argued to be reasonable and justifiable in certain instances, but we definitely do make the committee aware of all the legal issues as well as the constitutional concerns that are raised. Following on that, the committee will then go on to decide on whether any of the proposals are taken on board. So while the committee is not obliged to take on every single comment that comes from the public submissions, because some of them is policy related, and it's often in consultation with the department that the committee will decide whether that policy issue fits into the general context of the bill or not. All submissions are given due deliberations, due considerations, and this then leads to amendments being proposed by the committee. And those amendments then translate into what they call a B bill. I don't know if people have seen a B bill, but all the proposed amendments are contained in an A list, which is 80 seed. So if ever you made a public submission and you want to know what proposals the committee is going to be making or has proposed, these are contained in an A list. That is the list of all the amendments. And that A list then translates into what they call the B bill, which will then be the bill that was introduced, incorporating all the amendments. And that B bill then is the one that gets sent to the National Assembly for adoption and then gets sent to the second house. So again, in the second house, there will be a call for comment. So there's a lot of opportunity for public participation. Comments do get considered. They may not all be taken on board, but your submissions do matter. But because we're still in the process of formulating this draft bill, all submissions and all recommendations can be sent to Honorable Webster here, who will give it due consideration and will obviously take decisions on whether it gets incorporated or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was insightful. I enjoyed that. It definitely was a masterclass. It definitely was a masterclass. No, I enjoy it. It's empowering, and I think it makes, well, at least for me, it made me feel like I'm part of it. So it's not just storytelling or wishing that, you know, we could be involved, but it is true, amandla, our way to, and we are involved and can participate. And thank you for letting us know how to do that. We appreciate you. Wow. I'm sounding like the ambulance again. Wow, wow, wow. The feedback that I'm getting indicates that the bill is urgently needed. It's a strong indication. It's like we said earlier, the baby is here and everybody can hear the baby cry. So the bill is needed. It is long overdue, but it is also poised to deliver meaningful benefits to the people of South Africa. Stakeholders from the surveys that we've taken in so far and thoughts around the room today and on the chat online indicates that it is widely believed that this bill will address the systemic inequalities, strengthen fairness in recruitment and current employment, and represent essentially a step forward, protecting workers and restoring dignity. That's the sense that we feel, restoring dignity in the labor market and restoring dignity for all people. The aim is to liberate, and that's what we are all a part of. So colleagues, partners, people of South Africa, thank you for the depth, the honesty, and the generosity in today's engagement. I do realize that you could have chosen to be anywhere else, and you chose to be a participant and not just an observer of the democratic process. So thank you. Your insights, critique, and lived experiences have added substance in the refinement of the Fair Pay Bill and will directly shape the outcome of the next phase of this work. We are grateful. We're grateful to the speakers who took to the podium. We're grateful for online participants. We are grateful for the many organizations and the sectors represented in the room. This is me extending to you 2 words, 8 letters. I'm trying to say thank you. We are grateful for the expertise that you provide and the collective effort to write on social media. I saw people tagging, Bossa tagging, hashtag Fair People. Continue to do that because you're drawing in more participation. It's unbelievable the influence that we already have. It's not a conversation that do we have influence? Should we know we all have influence? And thank you to all of those who are already saying I'm participating. It is greatly noted and deeply needed. We will circulate a summary of the key inputs today and keep you updated by way of a brief pack in the coming days. So look out in your emails and always check your spam folder, and along with the details on the next steps, right, in the parliamentary process and opportunities as we've heard to continue to be participants. And there is a website, you might have seen it on the banner, www.fairpay, say it with me, www.fairpaybill.co.za. Come on now. It's where you will input some of your thoughts. You know, sometimes it's an overwhelm of the opportunity. And then later on, while you're washing your dishes or sending an email to your boss, you realize, oh, this is what I should have said. That's the opportunity to go online and say your say. I'm extending it 2 words, 8 letters. I'm trying to say thank you, but with sincere thanks from me, Nandi Boss, the team, everybody involved. Again, thank you. This session is formally adjourned. Stay for lunch. Where is Sima? When I'm at home doing this slightly informally, there's always a time to point to the kitchen. Where is Sima? I'm pointing to the kitchen. I formally adjourned, but I want the kitchen to tell us, you know, where to get the knives and fork. You know, where to leave the dirty dishes. It's such a joy to be here today. Sima is going to just chat to us around lunch, how we do it, and networking opportunities. But from my side, it was good.
Dynamites come in small packages. Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, before we speak food, Nande shared 8 letters. So we are also going to share those 8 letters. Sithi, Enkosi, Siyabulela, Bayadangi, Riyaleboha. We are grateful for your gift that you've shared with us today. We're grateful for the wisdom that is intertwined in everything that every speaker spoke and you spoke back to us. We are grateful for your mind. We're grateful that you would share your mind with us. We're grateful you would share your gift of speaking with us and engagement with us. We're grateful for your connection, connecting the speakers, connecting each and every individual here, connecting the words that were shared here. And we are most grateful that you didn't just honor the invite, you were also gorgeous at it. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We appreciate you so much. There was an analogy that was used here of a baby that, so I'm going to continue on the baby. This baby was birthed by a citizen, but as far as I know, as a young mother, every person who gives birth must have a doula, someone who's going to hold you as you give birth, someone who's going to encourage you as you give birth, someone who's going to tell you when to stop and tell you when to go. Am I right?
Yeah.
Someone who's then going to say, well done, at the end. We have that kind of woman here. A woman who took something from a mere mortal like the rest of us and decided that it was not enough for this individual to speak about his own personal story, but let this story be intertwined within our legislation so that the voices of the people show up in how South Africa is governed. That woman, that vision doula, is Nobuntu. And so we thank you, MP Honorable Hlazo Webster, for honoring what has been gifted to you and then allowing it to shape the next generation of South Africa. The next person that we want to thank, she's also a dynamite I saw when she was sharing here. But I know that us dynamites, we are very smart. We're very smart.
Yeah.
We confuse the devil. And she gave us her intellect. She gave us her knowledge. She gave us her experience. And I think we all leave here now understanding what the parliamentary process is and how legislation comes about. That it's not just about the individuals here who argue. Speaker, what's those things that in point of order, Speaker. Now we understand that the picture is so much bigger because you have given us clarity. So, Daksha, thank you so much. Smart ladies. Okay. So we're going to thank two people, lastly. We're going to start with Robin. When I grew up, there was always this teacher, Miss Hayes, in my English class who said, no question is a stupid question. And it gave us permission to ask questions even when we thought they were dumb questions. But there are people who are gifted with answering questions that make you feel more intelligent than maybe you think you are. So Robert, we want to thank you. We want to thank you for giving us and shedding light to all of the questions that were shared here. I believe that everyone walks away smarter because of how you engaged with us. Thank you. And lastly, Nikki. As a student of law, I know how unpacking the law is difficult, but it's even more difficult to relay it to people who are not necessarily within that field. And I think what you have done is bring life to something that may feel distant to most people and bring it to understanding, crystallize it, so that we can tap into it in everyday engagement. So thank you so much. Nandek has already said to all of you. But I also want to say thank you for allowing me this opportunity. And as we are going to go engage in some mapapas, we are going to exit either this door or that door, depending on the door that's closest to you. What we ask, please, is that everything that you've utilized, all of the bottles, cups, if you could just please exit with it so that you put it in the rubbish bin. And then we are going to go towards the left of the doors. There is a restaurant, Tanya will guide you, and that is where our lunch will be served. In the case that you do not have time to sit, there's also an opportunity for you to dish up, wrap your food up, and leave with it. So thank you so much. We appreciate you, and let's go rebuild something.